we're very excited to have a lot of time booked for what I hope is a useful and exciting discussion on this prospect of thinking through post-colonial France. Let me begin by just kind of letting you know who's up here and what the format's going to be, and then I'm going to frame the discussion with maybe 5 or 10 minutes of comments, and then we'll hear from Yarimar and Mayanthi. So Mayanthi, Fernando, and Yarimar Bonilla are going to give longer papers, and we have 4 discussants, and the idea is that the discussants are both going to engage the issues that are raised by the papers, but also kind of use these papers and these fascinating and important examples that Yarimar and Mayanthi are putting on the table as a starting point for a kind of broader discussion about politics today, about post-colonial politics today, and kind of about maybe this, how they may or may not invite us to reconsider certain aspects of post-colonial theory or kind of debates within post-colonial studies that we're used to. So let me start with a brief introduction, so at least you know who's who here. To my right here is Mayanthi Fernando, who is a professor of anthropology at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and currently a visiting professor at Wesleyan University. She's in anthropology, did I say that? Wesleyan University in the program in feminist, gender, and sexuality studies. And she's completing her first book from which her paper and comments are drawn, which is titled Asymmetries of the Republic, Islam, Secularism, and the Future of France, which is forthcoming from Duke University Press. Next to her is Yarimar Bonilla, assistant professor of anthropology. I'm not doing the assistant associate stuff. Professor of anthropology and Caribbean studies at Rutgers University, and she's finishing her first book from which her paper is drawn, Guadeloupe is Ours, Negotiating Labor, History and Sovereignty in the French Antilles. And both Yarimar and Mayanthi are doing just extremely interesting and important work. So this is a great opportunity to kind of get a little view of the work that's going to be forthcoming and to kind of get a sense of the debates and discussions that I'm sure these books will generate in the coming years. We're also extremely lucky that 4 other colleagues have given their time to kind of think with Mayanthi and Yarimar about their papers and to kind of think more generally about their implications. So let me just let you know who's here. All the way to my right is Vincent Crapanzano, who is a professor in the Anthropology program and Comparative Literature program here at the Graduate Center. Author of many books, but most recently, The Harkies, The Wound That Never Heals, which I understand is already translated to French and is getting really excited and positive reviews in France. Vincent's also the author of Horizons, an essay in literary philosophical anthropology, Serving the Word, American Literalism from the Pulpit to the Bench, and many other books. Next to Vincent is Anthony Alessandrini. I know Tony, but I can't find his. Who's a professor of English at Kingsborough Community College. And he's also a fellow at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, and was a fellow at the Committee on Globalization and Social Change, so was with us. His book, which is also extremely exciting, and I've had the pleasure of reading parts of it, is called Something Different, Fanon and the Future of Cultural Politics, which is forthcoming in 2013. And he's the editor of France Fanon Critical Perspectives and one of the co-editors at Jadalia, the e-zine. Next to me here is Kaiama Glover, who's a professor in the French department in the African Studies program at Barnard in Columbia. Her book is titled Haiti Unbound, A Spiralist Challenge to the Postcolonial Canon, and she's now working on a book titled Disorderly Women, Narcissism, Community, and Gender in the Novels of the French-Speaking Caribbean. And to my left is Judith Serkis, an professor of history at Rutgers University, author of Sexing the Citizen, Morality and Masculinity in France, 1870 to 1920, and is now writing a book called Scandalous Subjects, Intimacy and Indecency in France and French Algeria, 1830 to 1930. I think this is kind of a perfect lineup for this kind of conversation, in part because I've been in conversation with everyone here for the last few years, and I found it to be extremely useful, and I want to draw many of you guys into that conversation. So let me just say a little bit about the kind of broader frame, the idea that was the genesis of this. So the idea was to kind of, obviously, on some level, through these papers, to think France from the perspective of the post-colony, right? So to kind of move beyond a set of fairly parochial discussions within French studies, French history, about republicanism, universalism, and national identity with respect to the kind of familiar topics and so-called problems of immigration, assimilation, integration, liberal multiculturalism. And the idea was that maybe we could push open these conversations within French studies and consider contemporary France in relation to kind of bigger and broader debates that have come out of post-colonial studies and post-colonial theory, whether regarding racial formations, knowledge production, uneven or unequal development on global scales, any number of issues. Issues about which a lot of scholarship on France, though I must say outside of literature departments, seems to be an exception, seem to often willfully ignore. But on the other side, part of the idea here was that although France has been a crucial reference point for post-colonial theory and colonial studies, obviously think Haiti, Indochina, Algeria, with regard to popular revolution and national liberation. And of course, Francophone thinkers have been central to the genesis of post-colonial thinking and theory. Obviously, the genealogy running from Césaire to Fanon, Glisson, and others, not to mention Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines themselves. Despite this, and these kind of obligatory references, it seems to me that the French cases and examples have not, for the most part, been important reference points or optics through which to kind of grasp the nature and contours of post-coloniality, whether in the in the immediate post-colonial period or today. So I think that's an important double push from these papers. But my interest is not simply in kind of gathering all of us together, is not just including France in conversations about post-coloniality, but really to think through post-colonial France, to use these kinds of examples and cases as starting points and optics through which to reflect on the extraordinarily rich political landscape that confronts us in this historical conjuncture, clearly in relation to which our inherited political categories seem to be impoverished, in relation to which our frameworks of political analysis so often seem to be inadequate. So these cases can help us, I think, or challenge us or invite us to think about our political present as it's unfolding. And also, as I said, it's an opportunity to kind of take stock of post-colonial theory today, to the kinds of questions we within post-colonial theory have been asking for a long time, the categories we tend to use, the futures that are often envisioned within it, and kind of not to anticipate too much the discussion that is coming, but to my mind, just as a kind of one set of thoughts to throw on the table as we go, I continue to be struck by the deeply embedded assumptions about a kind of quasi-natural association between territory, consciousness, and like political interest or political identification or alignment. And it seems to me that for all kinds of good reasons that we know about, post-colonial thinking and criticism for a long time has been rightly concerned with cultural singularity and incommensurable life worlds, with a critique of Eurocentrism and universalism, but a critique that may be a one-sided critique of universalism and Eurocentrism and universalism, and rightly concerned with questions of sovereignty and self-determination, but as they now appear to us, may be overly circumscribed or restricted conceptions of sovereignty and self-determination. And it seems to me that the kind of really important work done by so many of our teachers and colleagues and friends and interlocutors over the years have moved us in such profound and kind of, earth-shaking ways, and yet have left us, it seems to me, and these are my thoughts and not these guys' thoughts at all, and this could be a source of debate, but have left us, it seems to me, in a place where it's very difficult, analytically, politically, to consider phenomena like plural democracy, intercontinental solidarity, planetary politics, cosmopolitan futures, or even human emancipation as anything but kind of ruses of power, symptoms of cultural alienation, somehow Euro-American ideological mystifications that need to be unmasked as provincial projections and impositions, which they certainly are and have been and should be. That's an important critical move. But it also, I also wonder, and I'll end here by kind of raising the question, I wonder whether that kind of orientation makes too big a concession that the kind of ongoing struggle against imperialism and for emancipatory forms of political association may not want to, a price that we may not want to think. And I guess finally, another issue that these guys put on the table, these examples and our discussion, is ways of thinking about the kind of complex relations between past and present that move beyond kind of pendulum swinging debates between continuity or rupture. To kind of think about the kind of contemporaneity of imperial past in the political present in ways that aren't simply a continuation or a memory or a trauma, but in some kind of dynamic relationship. And I think both of these papers do this in extraordinary ways. So I'll stop there and just say how pleased I am to welcome Mayanthi and Yarimar. The format is that they're each going to talk for about a half hour, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, I'm not sure. Layout, really condensed, I won't want to say the whole, there are lots in each of these papers. Then we're going to take a break, and then each of our commentators is going to kind of reflect out loud with the papers about these issues, and we'll have lots of time. We'll take a coffee break and lots of time to think. So I hope you guys have the fortitude for what really the idea is discussion, not performance. All right.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you for the invitation also to both of us to present. Thank you to the discussants. I really look forward to the comments. I should just note quickly that the papers that we sent to the four discussants were a little bit longer than what I'm going to present, so I apologize in advance with things that were cut. And thank you all also for coming through this pretty horrid weather. So I, like Gary said, the paper I'm going to present is drawn from my book manuscript, which is currently in progress. And so I'm just going to sort of dive right in. The paper is called France is my, can we not have that?
You can do that. Oh, you don't want this at all?
Not right now. Is that possible?
Want to just announce it then? And then you can pop that up.
Pretend you didn't see that.
Sorry.
That's okay. So I'm just going to kind of dive right in. In The Suffering of the Immigrant, a seminal ethnography of immigration and exile from the late 1970s, the sociologist Abdelmalek Sayed writes of the politeness inhabited by first-generation Algerian immigrants, the way in which the immigrant is always anxious not to disturb the dominant majority. As a result, Sayed writes, immigrants either become as invisible as they can, or they reassure their hosts by trying to resemble them, quote, attenuating the distinctive signs that make them stand out. But the height of both civil and political impoliteness, he continues, seems to be attained by those immigrants who are not immigrants, the children of immigrants. They are not foreigners in cultural terms, as they are integral products of their society, nor are they foreigners in national terms. We therefore do not know how to regard or treat these new-style immigrants, nor do we know what to expect of them, unquote. The term Sayed uses to describe post-colonial France, that he used to describe post-colonial France 4 decades ago, invisibility and visibility, distinctive signs, sartorial and otherwise, that render certain populations too conspicuous, politeness and impoliteness, these terms remain remarkably relevant in the present and help to frame this paper. French Republican citizenship is grounded on a distinction between universal and particular, and it demands that citizens abstract their attachments to particular racial or religious identities in order to be properly French. However, alongside this imperative to universalize, the French Republic has also been defined since its inception by a parallel imperative to particularize, which of course Gary has pointed out. These simultaneous imperatives to universalize and to particularize demand that Muslims abstract their Muslimness from the public sphere and render impossible any such abstraction. This paper considers how a generation of immigrants who are not immigrants, living within that double bind, attempt nonetheless to undo it. I call this generation Muslim French to signal their investment in practicing Islam and French citizenship, and in reimagining their Muslimness as always already French. We should remember that Muslim French identity and a concomitant Muslim French political imagination is constructed within and against a discursive and institutional context in which Muslims are always figured as a sign of alterity. For example, recent veil bans and other restrictions on citizenship and nationality render Muslims conditional citizens, if citizens at all. Despite the unrelenting power of a dominant imaginary in which Muslim means not French and French means not Muslim, however, Muslim French operationalize a political project of capacious citizenship and envision another future for France. It is to that project that I now turn. Every year since 1983, the Union of Islamic Organizations of France, or UOIF, has held an ever-growing annual congress on the northern outskirts of Paris. In 2003, about 80,000 people attended the four-day event, which features a marketplace, a fatwa tent, and panels by Muslim intellectuals, activists, and religious scholars. On April 20th, 2003, Farid Abdelkrim took the stage. He was introduced as a founding member and former president of the Young Muslims of France, or JMF, one of the satellite organizations of the UOIF dedicated to youth issues. Built like a rugby player and dressed neatly in a black shirt and black trousers, Farid immediately established a sense of familiarity with his public, alternating between joking self-deprecation and an aggressive, sometimes haranguing exhortation of the audience. And this is kind of how he was in real life, too. That Sunday afternoon, Farid invoked his dead father, who had come from a small village in Algeria to work for the National Railway. Not as a conductor or a driver, Farid noted pointedly, but as a rail track layer. He spoke eloquently and forcefully about the need for historical memory, reminding his audience that our parents built this country on their backs. He then turned to the present day. "Stop talking to me about integration," he thundered to wild applause. "I'm here and I'm French. France is my homeland. The Republic is mine. La France est mon bled. La République est la mienne." He urged the crowd to choose the party they preferred and to vote in municipal, regional, and national elections. Nicolas Sarkozy, then Interior Minister and later President of France, had spoken the evening before, and Farid suddenly demanded towards the end of his speech, only half joking, "Would you vote for me as Interior Minister?" At this point, the 10,000-person crowd roared in appreciation, and many people, most of them in their 20s and 30s, rose to give Farid a standing ovation as older members of the UOIF looked on in consternation and tried to get the crowd to sit down. Farid ended his speech with the booming exhortation, "Engagement, engagement, engagement," which essentially means action. Part of this engagement, or engagement, and of the Muslim French claim to France as their homeland, entails a concerted effort to Frenchify or franciser the Islamic tradition institutionally, exegetically, and culturally. Franciser was a term used by Munya and Shiraz, two sisters in their late 20s whose parents emigrated from Tunisia to the city of Nantes in the 1960s. At the time of my field work, both were active members of the Nantes branch of the JMF. The sisters had created an innovative head covering that looks less like a traditional headscarf and more like a cloth fedora with a neck scarf attached. They had recently begun selling versions of it at the yearly UOIF Congress. In explaining the motivation for their sartorial creation, Munya claimed it as a way to adapt and to integrate. Shiraz disagreed vehemently. "What am I integrating into? I'm French," she said. Munya contended that Shiraz had misunderstood her point, that though covering the head, neck, and ears remains an obligation for Muslim women, the precise form that covering takes can be culturally specific. Muslim French women therefore need to franciser the headscarf. "We're not in Iran, we're not in Egypt, we're not in Tunisia, we're in France," Munya said. She was not arguing that Muslims are not integrated into French society and need to adapt, but rather that because practicing Muslims like her are already French, they need to act like it and not adopt dress styles from the Middle East or the Maghreb. Munya's reasoning draws implicitly on one of the major interpretive trends within the modernist and reformist currents of the contemporary Islamic revival, namely the abstraction of Islam into the sight of fundamental principles and universal values like justice, equality, and rationality that are instantiated differently in different historical and cultural contexts. Best exemplified in Europe by theologian Tariq Ramadan, who himself draws on a much longer interpretive tradition concerning the relationship between divine and human law. This position takes the Sharia as the immutable revealed path of God, and fiqh as the human articulation of the Sharia, and therefore always dynamic, always evolving according to changing circumstances. Ramadan, who is widely read by many Muslim French, writes, and I quote, "The application of Islamic law and jurisprudence, or fiqh, necessarily takes into consideration the sources, i.e. the Quran and the Sunnah, and the social, cultural, political, and economic context. This application is evolving and flexible, it progresses and regresses, and represents the Sharia at any given moment in history in any given society," unquote. By underscoring the historicity of Islamic jurisprudence, Ramadan is able to move to a particular consideration of Islam in Europe, where circumstances quite different from those in majority Muslim regions necessitate, he argues, new approaches, new concepts, new fiqh. Though Islam is universal, indeed, because Islam is universal, Ramadan contends, and I quote him again, "There should be an Islam rooted in the cultural universe of Europe, just as there exists an Islam rooted in African Norwegian tradition. Islam and its Islamic references is one and unique. The methods of judicial application are, however, differentiated, and its concretization in a given place and a given time is by nature plural," unquote. One of the most interesting effects of Ramadan's theology is the way in which, by making Islam the site of the universal, he also locates France as the site of the particular, culture, thereby turning on its head the common republican paradigm in which France is universal and Islam particular, as culture, as religion, as race. There exists no incompatibility between being French and being Muslim, according to Ramadan's framework, because those French values that are universal, liberty, equality, fraternity, for example, are already encompassed by the Islamic tradition, and those that are particular, i.e. particular cultural practices and particular instantiations of universal values, are already shared by Muslims by dint of their being French. The irony, of course, is that most French Republicans, balk at the notion that their universal values are those of Islam, and therefore shared by Muslims. In other words, it is precisely when Muslim French accept the universality of many Republican values that the Republican universal comes crashing down to the particular always contained within. The claims to French citizenship that Muslim French make were most strikingly displayed during a December 2003 demonstration against the proposed law banning headscarves in public schools. About 3,000 to 4,000 demonstrators, most of them young women, many of them clad in red, white, and blue headscarves, marched from the Place de la République to the Place de la Bastille, chanting slogans and holding placards, all in French. One sign read, "School my path, the veil my choice, France my right, la France mon droit." A number of the young women held aloft their national identity cards and their voter registration cards. Some of the young women at the head of the cortege had faded French flags wrapped around poles in the fashion of the revolutionary period. As we approached the Bastille, a message rippled through the crowd. The few hundred men were told to get out of the cortege as the women were going to storm the Bastille, whereupon a number of young women, many of them in headscarves, climbed atop the base of the gilded column that marks the site of the former prison, the storming of which symbolically constitutes the founding moment of the Revolutionary Republic. Through these various means, wearing red, white, and blue, holding aloft national identity cards and voter registration cards, storming the Bastille, through these means, the women in the demonstration inscribed themselves into the French nation, presenting themselves as classical citoyennes, adorned not only with the symbolic accoutrements of the citizen, the flag, but also with the practical tools of active citizenship, the national identity card and the voter registration card. That gesture of inscribing, which one is here? Sorry. I am not used to PCs. Thank you.
bottom right.
This one? Aha.
No,
HBCs. That gesture, so the same gesture as the demonstration I just described, that gesture of inscribing Muslims into the founding moment of the Republic was repeated recently by the Collective Against Islamophobia in France for its Nous sommes aussi la nation, we are also the nation campaign. One of the images in a series of advertisements, which we should note that the RATP, the Paris Transit Authority, refused to display because of its religious character and political demands, this image reimagines David's revolutionary tennis court oath, which reimagines David's revolutionary tennis court oath in the present, with veiled women, Arab men in hoodies, and visibly Orthodox Jews, among other citizens, holding aloft French flags and copies of the oath. Gone is the politeness Syed ascribed to the first generation, replaced by the self-confident claiming of France as a right of citizenship, and the depiction of Muslims as original, revolutionary citoyens. Importantly, these Muslim French claims to France do not imply a break with the past and with a complicated history that inextricably links France to Algeria, its former settler colony, and to Morocco and Tunisia, its former protectorates. Recall Farid's declaration that La France est mon bled, a declaration with various layers of meaning. Bled is an Arabic word that means both village and homeland. On the face of it then, by declaring France as his bled, Farid makes a strong claim of national belonging, averring that France, rather than Algeria, is his homeland, and marking a clear distinction between the national cultural sensibilities of his parents' generation, whose bled is overseas, and his own generation, whose bled is very much France. Yet even as he makes this distinction, his use of the term bled simultaneously Arabizes France, seamlessly configuring it as a Muslim Maghrebi place. His use of the phrase calls attention to the ways in which the metropolitan presence of Maghrebi French like him and his parents, and the ensuing linguistic, cultural, and religious pluralism has brought about a new France. The new France imagined by Muslim French is also an old France, however, and Farid's pluralization of his bled operates on both diachronic and synchronic registers. The Muslim French reconfiguration of France constitutes a distinctly post-colonial project in which post suggests not a spatial or temporal break, but rather an ineluctable connection between colonial pasts and post-colonial presents. Muslim French ground their claims to France, France my right, not only in their birth and education there, but also in the fact that their grandparents fought and died in France's colonial armies during the two world wars, as well as in the fact that their parents worked to rebuild metropolitan France in the aftermath of World War II. On the heels of his reminder that our parents built this country on their backs, Farid pointed out to me that individuals like him were not present in France by accident. It's not like we got lost along the way, he said. People have to realize that, and France has to assume its destiny. By staking a claim to France through their ancestors, Muslim French like Farid reconnect French colonial history to the nation's present and future, transforming conventional notions of French history by positing not only their present, but also their past, their ancestors, the Arabs and Berbers, as an integral part of France's national historical narrative, not just of their own particular history. To reweave the histories of France and Algeria together, reconstituting colonial Algeria as French and post-colonial France as Algerian, is not simply to make a historical claim, however, but also to reconceptualize the present and the future of France. The historicity inscribed into Muslim French politics also presupposes a futurity. France does not simply have to assume its past, but also, as Farid notes, its destiny. Indeed, the two are ineluctably linked. Thus, the aim of Muslim French attention to France's colonial genealogy is not, as many Republican critics anxiously and angrily contend, not to make the Republic atone for its past, but rather to enable all French to imagine the present and the future more capaciously. Not incidentally, by conjuring forth a new political imagination for the future, one that emerges out of the historical and contemporary realities of France, Muslim French implicitly reverse the accusation of communalism that is consistently directed against them by mainstream Republican politicians and scholars. Through this reversal, Republicans become those with a meager grasp of history, a narrow understanding of community, and consequently an impoverished political imagination. As a number of scholars have noted, the Republican tradition constitutes itself and its authority by establishing a powerful sense of political and cultural continuity of French identity over time, positing an unbroken link that stretches back through Renan to Rousseau and sometimes all the way back to Charlemagne. A recent book titled Proud to be French, Fier d'être Français, by the novelist and popular historian Max Gallo, for example, begins with 5 dated epigraphs from the 11th, 16th, and 20th centuries to produce a continuous notion of France. Such continuity erases both the epistemic ruptures over 900 years and the purposeful construction of modern France through various military, political, and legal operations. More specifically, the myth of continuity politically enables mainstream Republicans to claim the Republican model of citizenship as somehow authentically French, and therefore integral to the continuation of French national identity. And I would add, too, that scholars who focus too much on France's post-imperial condition and of the ostensible disruption caused by Muslims concede too much to this narrative of continuity. By undoing this continuity, or to be more precise, by radically expanding it to such an extent that continuity and rupture become difficult to disentangle, as well as by writing those excluded from an ostensibly continuous French identity back into France's history, Muslim French undo the tight relation between contemporary Republican politics and Frenchness. One major element of the Muslim French historicist futurist project of reconfiguring France, of imagining politics and citizenship otherwise, entails the normalization of the practice of Islam, including its public practice, as simply one more way of being French. Note the precise nature of this reconfiguration. Muslim French, like Farid, do not simply contend that one can be both French and Muslim, that practicing Islam and being a French citizen are compatible, which is how the sort of generous reading of the Islamic revival by American and French scholars proceeds. Rather, Muslim French make the more radical claim that Muslim is French, and French is Muslim. By claiming that Muslim is French, Muslim French problematize any neat separation between public and private, politics and religion, and universal and particular, a separation that secular Republican citizenship both constantly demands and consistently contravenes. By refusing even to attempt to make themselves invisible, which is of course an impossible task, and by demanding why their Muslimness is subsequently read as excessively visible, as impoliteness, Muslim French reveal the particular racial and religious attachments embedded within the Republican universal and within the supposedly neutral public political sphere. But beyond merely unmasking universalist Republican citizenship as actually particular, they also propose a new political horizon, making it possible to imagine as equally French other ways of organizing the polity. Now, this reimagining is not, I want to emphasize, simply a demand for the recognition of Muslim difference, the conventional framework through which the Islamic revival and Muslim French activism are interpreted by most scholars, and certainly by mainstream politicians and intellectuals in France. Most Republican critics decry the unacceptable public assertion of so-called Muslim difference that contravenes the Republic's commitment to moral and political universalism. More sympathetic voices, many of them drawing on Charles Taylor's seminal framework of the politics of recognition, also view the Islamic revival as a demand for the recognition of Muslim difference, but call on the Republic to accommodate this Muslim difference, always within reason, of course, right? Both sides therefore reinscribe an essential notion of France within which Muslims remain a sign of alterity, a notion of France that Muslim French fundamentally refute. Farid, in fact, explicitly refused the trope of difference. Slogans like the right to difference, he declared, contribute to the idea that we are still not entirely French. We are still separate. I don't want the right to difference. I want the right to indifference. Je ne veux pas le droit à la différence. Je veux le droit à l'indifférence. That is to say, I don't want people to pay attention to me. I want to be forgotten. By insisting on his right to indifference, Farid invokes a right to be unremarked by others, though on terms that do not necessitate assimilation into majority religious, cultural, and racial norms. In so doing, he attempts to reframe entirely the current debate about so-called Muslim difference, and his reframing is representative of a broader Muslim French political ethic. In contrast to the politics of Republican integration, which demands that Muslims restrict their particularity to the private sphere, Muslim French seek to publicly inhabit their non-normative identities, conventionally understood as their difference. But in contrast to a differentialist politics, they do not want their difference to be recognized as such. Consequently, Muslim French call implicitly and explicitly for the indifference to difference, such that difference is neither abstracted nor overdetermined, rendered neither invisible nor hypervisible. Muslim French demand the right to be visible but unremarkable, put simply, the right to be. Although the term unremarkable may seem an odd choice of word on my part, it captures both the Muslim French desire to be unremarked upon as well as the desire to represent an unexceptional occurrence in French public space, their Muslimness an ordinary way of being French. The desire to be ordinary propels many Muslim French to claim the public practice of Islam not as a right to difference, but rather as an entitlement of equal citizenship. Rather than occupying the place of difference within a more tolerant and inclusive France, the kind of positioning imagined by many French and North American public intellectuals who have called for the recognition and accommodation of Muslim difference as the solution to the cultural and political marginalization of Muslims. Rather than occupying the place of difference, Muslim French argue that they are not different, but rather French. Yunus, a member of the Collective of French Muslims, or CMF, and a longtime activist now in his early 40s, put it in the following terms, and I quote, "If one is a French citizen of Muslim faith, that means all spaces of dialogue, of social transformation, all these spaces concern us." Unquote. Here, Yunus disrupts the very notion of difference itself, imagining the polity as cross-cut by a multiplicity of differences without any essential form of non-difference, or majority. Yunus's spatial metaphor, all these spaces concern us, undoes the distinction between general and particular and center and periphery, which undergird both the Republican model of integration and the differentialist politics of recognition. Yunus's declaration has two connected meanings. First, as he explicitly announces, Muslim French can and should intervene in French society as a whole, and not only in their particular communities. But second, he implicitly argues that even when acting within their particular community, Muslim French are always already intervening within France more broadly, since Muslim French are, by definition, French. So why, then, the insistence among scholars and politicians in France and the US too, that Muslims are asking for the recognition of their difference? Why has recognition of difference become the dominant conceptual framework through which minority claims are so often interpreted and adjudicated in secular liberal societies? I want to think about this by going back to Charles Taylor, the touchstone for the framework of the politics of recognition, who utilizes Hegel's master-slave dialectic as an illustration not only of our intersubjectively determined identities, but also fundamentally of the necessity of mutual and equal recognition in such processes of identity formation. According to Taylor, struggles for recognition occur when the reciprocity of the recognition relation is not respected, and certain parties, i.e. marginalized minorities, are not recognized as they should be. Yet in his diagnosis of minority rights claims as claims for recognition, something interesting occurs. The original intersubjectivity of Hegel's recognition relation, an intersubjectivity that was fluid and flowed between subjects, becomes fixed, flowing in only one direction. Taylor's narrative permanently fixes minority and majority, transforming the exchange of recognition into a demand for recognition from the minority and a bestowal of recognition from the majority. In Taylor's essay, and in consequent debates by like-minded scholars about the politics of recognition, it is always an ontological minority that demands recognition from an ontological majority, and never the other way around. The politics of recognition is therefore both premised on and reproduces an arrangement in which certain ontological constellations are fixed as the normative majority identity, we, and everything else as difference. Moreover, in this arrangement, the majority's identity is always already stable, determined, fixed. It ostensibly does not require another subject's recognition in order to achieve satisfactory self-identity. That compulsion only applies to subordinate minorities. And yet, in Hegel's original story, it is the master who demands recognition, not the slave. One has to wonder then whether the insistence that it is minorities who demand recognition is not in fact a displacement of another demand for recognition, one that cannot be acknowledged, for to do so would, as with Hegel's master, would undermine the arrangement of dominant and subordinate that currently holds. To acknowledge that other need for recognition would destabilize and disrupt the sovereignty and unity of the majority, here France, a unity that is constantly, one could even say obsessively and anxiously, being iterated and reiterated. Hence the various debates on national identity, as well as the recent profusion of secular Republican hymns, we could call them eulogies maybe, to the nation, one and indivisible, with titles like What is France? How can one be French? And of course, Proud to be French. One could argue that these declarations of identity are also demands for recognition made by French Republicans in a context where self-certainty and sovereignty are lacking. But the demand for the recognition of France as one and indivisible, as historically, politically, and culturally continuous, as racially and religiously distinct, is, in truth, a demand for the misrecognition of France, a demand for the recognition of France as something that it is not and never has been. Consequently, the demand by Republicans that Muslim French accept the prior unity and integrity of France as an entity that exists without them, and within which they can only be a form of difference, is a demand that Muslim French fundamentally misrecognize France, and that is something that Muslim French refuse to do. Rather, by resuturing France to the Maghreb, and by imagining themselves as simultaneously Muslim and French, they reconfigure France into a robustly cosmopolitical entity, writing themselves into the past, present, and future, and enabling a capacious political imagination. Part of this reimagining entails disrupting the existing configuration of identity and difference, majority and minority, center and periphery. Difference is conceptualized not in relation to a center, which no longer exists, but rather in relation to various other identities, or we could call them differences. Difference, then, is always relational and constantly shifting, never essential. In many ways, Muslim French seem to understand better than some political theorists the inherently relational structure of the dyad identity difference. And by refusing their designation as essential difference, and by understanding difference not as deviation but as variation, Muslim French radically disrupt the fixedness of identity as French and the overdetermination of Muslim religiosity as difference. In so doing, they radically pluralize the polity itself. And it might be helpful here to reflect on philosopher Danielle Allen's distinction between the metaphors of oneness and wholeness in conceptions of the nation. Though oneness is often used as the main metaphor to describe a people or a nation, Allen instead proposes the metaphor of wholeness. The commitment to oneness, Allen argues, has often entailed practices that make citizens who are not part of the one people politically invisible. Wholeness offers a different vision, she contends, since the word whole can encompass multiplicity in a way that one cannot. Muslim French share a similar vision for the nation. Countering the oneness-oriented France propagated by most Republicans, a oneness that is incidentally inscribed into the French Constitution, which affirms the Republic as one and indivisible. Of course, it never has been either one or indivisible. Many Muslim French envision the community of citizens through the metaphor of wholeness, as an entity that Essia, another interlocutor, once called la République plurielle, or the plural republic. That polity is a space that cultivates heterogeneity rather than homogeneity, including the possibility of radical and incommensurable heterogeneities. It allows those formerly invisible or hypervisible, those too conspicuously visible, to be simply visible, that is, to be citizens. A plural republic also recognizes the legitimacy of non-dominant ways of life without classifying them as essential difference. Finally, by envisioning difference not as deviation but as variation, Muslim French pluralize difference to the extent that all communities are a form of difference, an arrangement that maps, as many of my interlocutors pointed out, that maps onto the heterogeneity of this world created by God. Part of the Muslim French reimagining of the polity entails, moreover, a commitment to disaggregating the center. Explaining the CMF's alliances with other progressive groups, Yunus told me that there are bridges that can unite disparate groups. For example, he continued, and I quote, I'm going to quote him at length, he said, "For me personally, on a religious level, I'm not going to defend gay marriage. Even if you say it's universal, I don't share in this universality." Which is sort of an interesting way of putting it, right? You say it's universal, I don't share in this universality. On the other hand, if you say to me, we're going to fight for the equal treatment between men and women, I agree. We're going to fight for equality between rich and poor nations, okay. That is to say, I have my corpus of references and I find bridges with others. We'll fight together at least according to the minimal values that we do share, unquote. So what's happening here is basically Yunus and the CMF, they work with progressive groups on specific projects, even though they do not share the same agenda across multiple political terrains. There are certainly difficulties to be negotiated in these spaces of radical heterogeneity, but I want to underscore the extent to which Muslim French, like Yunus, reject any a priori notion of political unity or oneness. Thus, their refusal of ontological oneness, also entails a radical disaggregation of the political itself. Instead, they embrace a future of ad hoc political formations that, by definition, cannot unite everyone, that constantly shift into new political constellations, and that encompass, at various times and across various issues, different parts of the whole. In so doing, they open a future of possibilities that exceeds available analytical, political, and even linguistic frames. And they do so, we should remember, against the unrelenting power of a discursive, legal, and political regime in which Muslim means not French, and French means not Muslim. Abdelmalek Sayed was correct then when he surmised that we therefore do not know how to regard or treat these new-style immigrants, nor do we know what to expect of them. The future, and I'll end here, the future remains unpredictable.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Gary, for organizing and creating this space. Mayanthi and I have known each other for a long time, and we always think that we're working on separate issues, but then when we present our work together, we realize all the different points of convergence, so I hope you guys see them. So the title of my presentation today is Non-Sovereign Futures, French-Caribbean Politics in the Wake of Disenchantment. On January 20th, 2009, the same day that Barack Obama was sworn into the presidency of the United States, labor activists in the French Overseas Department of Guadeloupe launched the largest general strike in their history. For a period of 44 days, schools and universities were closed, all major commerce was suspended, banks shut down, government services were discontinued, public transportation came to a halt, barricades blocked major roadways, and an estimated 100,000 people, 1/3 of the population, took to the streets in protest. And here are some kind of alternative postcards from the Caribbean from the time of the strike. Local observers declared that this was du jamais vu, something never before seen or even imagined. And many former nationalist activists declared that they could now die in peace because they had finally witnessed the awakening of the Guadeloupean people. In some ways, the rise of this movement can be seen as an echo of the rioting that shook continental France in 2005, bringing the ethnic and economic disparities of the French Republic to worldwide attention. It can also be seen as an early sign of larger winds of discontent being felt throughout the world, from the indignados of Spain to the demonstrators in Tahrir Square and the young occupiers of Zuccotti Park. Yet the strike in Guadeloupe also indexed a particular frustration, not just with global neoliberal economics, but with the failed promises of decolonization and the possibilities of post-colonial politics as viewed from the French Antilles. In 1946, Guadeloupe, along with Martinique, Réunion, and French Guyana, became an overseas department of France, Département d'Outre-mer, a status roughly similar to that of Hawaii or Alaska in the United States. This political status promised full integration into the French Republic, with political representation in the National Assembly, the extension of French civic institutions, and the promise of an economic and social leveling with the citizens of mainland France. Yet, as their prefix suggests, the departments of Outre-mer were marked from their origins as both geographically and categorically distinct, outside of and separate from the unmarked departments of the French mainland. The grievances of the 2009 strike index the many disparities that persist between the mainland and the Outre-mer, including stark differentials in the prices of consumer goods, disproportionate rates of unemployment, and a great variability in the cost, quality, and availability of basic services, such as public transportation, affordable housing, telecommunications, and others. During the period of the general strike, from January to March of 2009, media outlets in mainland France gave significant coverage to these events, featuring dramatic images of barricaded streets, overturned trash dumpsters, vehicles aflame, and angry demonstrators chanting in the streets, "Guadeloupe is ours, not theirs. They cannot do as they please in our country." Suddenly, the otherwise absent Outre-mer was at the center of national debate. Many observers began to question why these former sugar colonies remained within the French Republic, especially since their residents seemed unhappy with the arrangement. Although the French president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, insisted on the importance of the Antilles to the Republic, repeatedly asserting that their independence was out of the question, many were left wondering, what exactly is the contemporary relationship of these societies to the French nation? Are they exploited territories suffering from a form of neo-colonial domination, as some suggested? Or, as others argued, are they expensive welfare states, kept afloat through the benevolence of their former metropole? And what of these activists marching in the streets? If they were unhappy with the current political and economic relationship with France, why weren't they fighting for independence? Why would they criticize the legacies of French colonialism in the region, yet still opt to remain part of the French Republic? The questions that swirled around the 2009 strike are representative of the discourses that surround societies like Guadeloupe, which opted for juridical integration with their metropolitan centers rather than political independence. These places are often cast as political aberrations in a world of nation-states, and constructed as isolated exceptions to the rule of decolonization through political independence. But the fact is that in the Caribbean, one finds a large number of alternative political forms: territories, departments, protectorates, municipalities, and commonwealths, and overlapping zones of affiliation: the European Union, the British Commonwealth of Nations, the Kingdom of the Netherlands, etc., which challenge the hegemonic view of national sovereignty. And I'm currently working on a mapping project to try to represent this political topography a little better, but this is my first attempt at showing some of the places in the Caribbean that have a connection to a European polity. Oh, as you can see here, places like Guadeloupe, Puerto Rico, the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Anguilla, Aruba, Bermuda, Bonaire, the Cayman Islands, Curacao, Saba, St. Barth, St. Martin, and the Turks and Caicos, and others, all fall outside of the traditional definitions of either independent states or official colonies, at least not as defined by organizations such as the United Nations. I use the concept of non-sovereignty to analyze this topography of power, and to question the accepted notion of the sovereign nation-state as the political norm against which all other models are rendered exceptional. These societies are rarely talked about, either individually or as a whole, within scholarly discussions of either post-colonial or political sovereignty, precisely because they challenge normative assumptions about our contemporary political world. At best, they are dismissed as unexplained accidents of history. At worst, they are pathologized as sites of failed political emancipation. For example, a friend once asked me what it was like to be Puerto Rican, saying, "Is it like being in purgatory?" Now, underlying this type of discourse is the idea that non-sovereign societies suffer from a form of arrested development. That is, they are imagined as not having completed their historical ascension to national sovereignty, thus resulting in a state of unachieved political modernity. The idea that these societies are accidents of history, the lands that decolonization forgot, posits their existence as a gesture of post-colonial benevolence on behalf of their colonial centers, which are assumed to be subsidizing their economies at a purportedly high cost. Now, one example of this kind of narrative is an article that appeared in the French magazine Le Figaro, which calculated the cost of the French Overseas Department of Guadeloupe to the French Republic at 2.5 billion euros. Now, this is an odd equation, as the majority of these costs represent government salaries and public services common to any department of France. Thus, in this sense, Guadeloupe carries as much of a cost to the nation as does Paris. Moreover, the attempt to quantify the cost of Guadeloupe for French taxpayers fails to recognize that Guadeloupean residents are themselves also French taxpayers and major consumers of French goods and services. In fact, non-sovereign spaces have historically been a source of wealth for their colonial centers. It was the sugar fields and plantation economies of the Caribbean that fueled the economic development of Europe by feeding the coffers and workers of the Industrial Revolution. Today, the non-sovereign spaces of the Caribbean continue to serve as the economic and political scaffolding of the global economy by providing pools of outsourced labor, offshore financial havens, and overseas zones of unregulated military and tactical operations. Although the discourse of exceptionality surrounding non-sovereign societies has traditionally severed them analytically from theorizations of nominally sovereign nations, the socioeconomic conditions and political struggles unfolding in these places speak directly to the contemporary challenges faced by nominally sovereign states across the globe. In fact, one could argue that throughout the world, the forms of graduated and constrained sovereignty that we witness in places like Guadeloupe are increasingly becoming the norm rather than the exception, as supranational institutions increasingly set the terms of national economies, ranging from post-earthquake recovery assistance in Haiti to the fiscal bailout in Greece. And citizenship itself becomes increasingly defined by access to preferential labor markets and to a restricted array of rights and privileges. For example, the Federated States of Micronesia became independent in 1986, but their residents retained the right to live and work in the U.S. and to serve in its military, even though they are no longer U.S. citizens. By 2008, the country had more Army recruits, more U.S. Army recruits per capita, and more casualties in Iraq and Afghanistan than any state in the Union, second only to American Samoa, another non-sovereign society. Now let me be clear, this is not to say that we have entered a post-national world, that states are no longer important sites of governance, or that the ties that bind our imagined communities have become undone. And in fact, it should be stated that populations throughout the world, in places like Palestine, Kashmir, and in Catalonia, still battle for the creation or recognition of a national state apparatus. My argument is thus not that political sovereignty is waning, but that it has always been fragmented. That is, the bundle of relationships, rights, authorities, and jurisdictions that have been folded under the sign of sovereignty have always been subject to negotiation and contestation by state, non-state, and suprastate actors. The political topography of the Caribbean is testament to this fact. What has changed in our current era is thus not the nature of sovereignty, but its political deployment. Sovereignty has ceased to operate as a right to autonomy, becoming instead a capacity for governance. This has led to the proliferation of models such as the failed state index that establish a continuum or evolutionary hierarchy of sovereign nations. Thus, ominous image, right? This in turn allows for international intervention to be hailed as strengthening rather than undermining the capacity to rule of these purported failed states, while simultaneously allowing international organizations to abdicate responsibility for the internal instability their involvement generates. The new discourse of waning sovereignty thus makes it easier to justify foreign intervention into nominally sovereign states, to place other countries under international protectorship, and to recruit foot soldiers for economic and military ventures without the need to extend political and civic rights. As discourses of failed states and the imperatives of good governance are increasingly used to justify a new civilizing mission under the guise of spreading democracy and freedom into nominally sovereign states, there is less of a need to ambiguously incorporate and provide minimal rights to the residents of these territories. It is not coincidental then that during this time the political status of places like Guadeloupe are coming increasingly under revision through a wave of referendums, plebiscites, and other electoral performances. Many see these events as an attempt on the part of European countries to get rid of expensive old colonies, but in fact the new formulas put into place often offer an increase of economic ties with a decrease in political rights. Perhaps for this reason, local populations have responded to these referendum initiatives with resolute ambiguity, repeatedly voting against political change. When presented with a plethora of traditional political options, the residents of the non-sovereign Caribbean consistently opt for none of the above, preferring what I describe as relationships of strategic entanglement to the traditional models of incorporation or independence. However, I would like to suggest that the seemingly exceptional disinterest in political sovereignty among these groups is rooted in a disenchantment with the political categories of independence and national sovereignty. For example, when I asked Lucas, an active supporter of the 2009 strike, if he supported political independence for Guadeloupe, he responded by saying, and I quote, "It's not that I don't believe in independence for Guadeloupe, it's that I don't believe in independence. It doesn't exist anywhere. You're always dependent on something, on those who are more powerful, on those who have what you need. Political independence has no meaning without economic independence." He went on, "Those people who propose independence, they are charlatans. These are people who have clearly never looked around the Caribbean. They don't understand the power of a country like the United States and how it rules the region. Heck, they don't even understand a little country like France." Now, Lucas's words reflect a consciousness of the fictions of sovereignty and a clear understanding of its limits. Guadeloupean residents like Lucas recognize that sovereignty does not exist anywhere. They are embedded in a sea of nominally sovereign nations mired in post-colonial crises of structural adjustment international trade regulations, NGO shadow states, interventionist humanitarianism, and the heavy hand of supranational institutions that are said to carry out governance without government. Not to mention the role of imperial presences like the United States and what Lucas Riley describes as the little country of France. However, the lack of interest in political independence does not imply the absence of political subjectivity among these populations. For example, Guadeloupeans will often say that their citizenship is French, their passport is European, but their pays, their territory or country, is Guadeloupe. Being Guadeloupean in this context does not require a passport, currency, or flag, just as being a French citizen does not require a relinquishing of Guadeloupean distinctiveness. Further, as the massive strike in 2009 suggests, the disenchantment with national sovereignty should not be read as a disenchantment with politics itself, with the search for social change, the belief in collective action, and the attempt to find ways of asserting control over elements that impact daily life, including the rate of local wages, the cost of basic goods and services, the development of employment opportunities, and the elaboration of public policy on issues such as Creole language usage, educational curricula, and others. In other words, the 2009 strike demonstrates that sovereignty is not a yet-to-be-achieved political future, but the contemporary terrain upon which a fragmented set of relationships are negotiated by state and non-state actors. During the strike, a group of Antillean intellectuals issued a document in support of the movement titled Manifeste pour les produits de haute nécessité, a manifesto for products of high necessity. The authors suggested that behind the prosaic concern over purchasing power or the housewife's shopping basket looms the essential need for what gives meaning to our life, not just the desire for obtaining socioeconomic improvement and fulfilling basic needs, the première nécessité, but also the desire to fulfill deeper, more urgent needs, haute nécessité. The authors described the urgent needs of the Antilles as poetic needs, the needs of the imagination, the need to imagine an alternative future, or at the very least to believe that other futures are possible. The struggle against la vie chère, expensive life, was thus not just about the price of imported goods, but about the cost of compromising the sovereignty of the imagination. In the time I have left, I would like to explore how this vision of sovereignty, as a search for fulfilling certain collective needs, rather than a search for a political status, can be glimpsed through the political iconography that was generated during the 2009 strike. My presentation will focus not on the overt demands made by the activists, most of which centered around issues of the cost of living in Guadeloupe, but on the political symbols that emerged during the strike. My paper thus speaks to the general question of the role of the aesthetics in social movements and of how political content is encoded in aesthetic forms. But more specifically, in the case of Guadeloupe and of the non-sovereign Caribbean, I am also interested in asking whether it is possible that aesthetic form can give shape to a political project that could not otherwise be articulated. That is, in a place where concepts such as independence have become taboo, is it possible that other communicative forms beyond the discursive, the aesthetic, affective, sensorial, pictorial, and sonic, could be the generative sites of a new political imagination? In what follows, I focus particularly on how certain symbols of national sovereignty, a people, an anthem, a currency, a stamp, and the figure of the sovereign itself, are deployed by a movement that does not pose nationhood as one of its goals. My goal, however, is not to examine this as the representation of an exception to national sovereignty, but as a theorization of the nature of sovereignty itself. In other words, I ask, what does sovereignty look like from the space of Guadeloupe? So the first semiotic form that I would like to examine is the name that the activists organizing this movement adopted, which was the Lianage contre Profitation, or LKP. And in an English translation would be Alliance Against Profiteering or Exploitation. Now, it is important to note that the strike of 2009 was carried out not by a single labor union, but by a broad coalition of 48 different political, economic, cultural, and labor organizations. This included a wide assortment of trade unions, political parties, and pro-independence activists. But it also incorporated groups from what could be described as civil society, including environmental groups, consumer rights associations, and advocates for disability rights, fair housing, and cultural groups. It is important to point out that what emerged from these groups was not a political party. The LKP is not a political party, much less a vanguard party, but a coalition, reminiscent of the kind of new social movements we are seeing throughout the world, such as in Occupy Wall Street and Arab Spring, etc., in which different actors with divergent agendas, political orientations, and strategies are coming together under a common cause. These new forms of coalition politics lack a single unified demand. They are often coming together to work against certain politics currently in place, rather than towards a clearly articulated future. The LKP was criticized for not having a more overt political agenda and for rallying against something rather than for something. But in many ways, the lianage itself can be seen as its own goal. For to work towards lianage, which is the alliance, is to work towards unity and solidarity among Guadeloupeans. In many ways, this alliance resembles the kind of network politics that are said to typify contemporary social movement, particularly anti-corporate globalization movements. However, the concept of lianage is not just about connection and coordination, but about unity. Being on lianage requires acting in unison, under one voice, as a single entity. During the period of the strike, the renowned Martinican writer Edouard Glissant was asked if he could help explain the concepts of lianage and profitation to the minister of the Outre-mer. He responded, "La profitation," I won't say that in French. He responded, "Profitation is the source of anger, and lianage is that which allies, that which ties and binds, and rebinds what was not previously united in solidarity." The terms lianage and profitation are examples of the kind of principles that Glissant himself advocated. They offer a way of speaking to the world from your particular location. They are both concepts that are deeply singular and specific, yet richly resonant with the struggles of dominated people throughout the world, much like the battles against the 1% in the US or the struggles of the indignés in Spain. Glissant stressed that the words lianage and profitation needed to be understood as poetic formations, which I take to mean encapsulations of social relationships, collective imaginaries, hopes, and desires. Rather than offering a programmatic political program, they create a conceptual clearing, a new opening in the political imagination. They describe a moment, but they also give to that moment. They also produce that moment as they help articulate a new political vision and vocabulary. The second cultural sign that I would like us to consider is the song that became the anthem for the movement, Guadeloupe is ours, or Guadeloupe c'est à nous. And so in English, the lyrics, Guadeloupe, it is ours, Guadeloupe, it is not theirs. They cannot do as they please in our country. During the strike, these lyrics seemed to echo out of every corner in Guadeloupe. They were shouted by thousands of demonstrators during mass rallies, sung by children on the playground, blasted out of car radios and open windows, and emblazoned upon thousands of t-shirts sold by informal vendors on the side of the road. And here we have someone modeling a t-shirt. The slogan's ambiguity might explain its popularity, for it is unclear what exactly is being claimed or asserted in this moment of enunciation. Who constitutes the us, then? At first blush, Guadeloupe is ours, Guadeloupe is not theirs, might seem like an anti-colonial, anti-imperial slogan of a colonized us versus a colonized them. However, as the activists explained to me, this is not a divide of national or racial ascription, but of political and economic relationship to the island of Guadeloupe. They insisted that the nous of Guadeloupe c'est à nous was the group of people who struggled to improve the conditions of life on the island, while the yo, or them, were those who profit, les profitants, or profiteurs. Although the figure of the profitant emerges as a foil to a true Guadeloupean people, this rhetoric does not place the entire burden of the contemporary malaise of the Antilles on its colonial relationship with France. The profitant is not a clearly defined group, but the totality of winners in the relationships of colonialism, globalization, and neoliberalism. The target of protest is not just who established the colonial relationship, but who has and continues to profit from it to this day. This includes the French state, transnational corporations, local economic elites, and elected officials. And it's striking to me that in many ways it is reminiscent of the 1% discourse of Occupy. The next cultural icon that I wish to examine is the 200-euro banknote. Now, most people don't realize that Guadeloupe is actually on the banknote. Right there. Now, most of the demands of the LKP stretch the bounds of labor struggles by addressing colonial legacies and the expensive life of the Antilles. The only demand that could be seen as a traditional labor demand was the €200 monthly wage increase that they had asked for. Now, however, although it was the most traditional labor demand, it was also the demand that seemed the most implausible. At a time when workers were experiencing salary reductions, furloughs, and layoffs in many parts of the world, how could these labor activists on the margins of Europe possibly achieve a salary hike? And how could a community without national sovereignty raise its minimum wage? Perhaps because it was the most audacious demand, the €200 wage increase also became the most iconic, seen throughout the strike in signs, banners, T-shirts, and other images. And this is one sign, the €200 anu, right? So kind of claiming of this €200 as ours. But I want to focus on this image. This is Eli Domota, was the leader of the LKP, and in the longer version of the paper, I talk about how he was considered the Guadalupean Obama. And so in the T-shirt that he's wearing, he has the €200 note being equivalent to 100 bouquet of soup, which is something that you can buy in the store, kind of ready to make soup stock. So yeah, a soup bouquet, a little tied up bunch of herbs and vegetables, commonly sold for €2. So that's why the equation is 200. €200 banknote is 100 of these €2 soup bouquets. Now, part of what is striking about this image is that it speaks to that particular quality of money, the basic fact that money is exchangeable and can stand in for something else. It has been said that part of the fungibility of money is its ability to both make and break social ties, to break ties from their source and create new ties as it enters into exchange. Thus, in this image, one must ask, how are the ties between the euro and Europe being remade? Did this re-equation of the €200 banknote sever it from its source? Is the euro here being appropriated as a Guadalupean currency? The logo above the equation reads, in the country of Guadeloupe, €200 equals 100 soup bouquets. But of course, Guadeloupe isn't a country, or at least not an independent nation state. So the impossibility of a piece of paper being equal to 100 bouquets of herbs and vegetables is held together under the equally fantastical notion of the country of Guadeloupe as a place where this equation becomes possible. The €200 note appeared in many different T-shirts, signs, and images during the strike, but there is one final image that I would like us to consider, that of a fictional postage stamp that circulated on the internet. So the image draws on the famous Shepard Fairey Hope poster that circulated widely during Barack Obama's presidential campaign. While the Obama poster had simple blue and red color blocks in the background representing the blue states and red states that Obama was campaigning to unite, the LKP version replaces the red block of the Obama poster with the yellow graphic of a €200 banknote. The €200 note thus serves as a backdrop. It represents both the promise and the guarantee of the political project that Domota embodies. This image suggests that the kind of political project developed here is one that draws on the political and economic rights, labor markets, and geographic mobility that European integration allows. Although it posits the spokesperson of the movement as a type of sovereign, it questions the idea of a sovereign state operating independently of other political communities. Further, although the image places a small Guadeloupe logo above Domota's portrait, the main caption underneath his image is the word lianage, as the kind of abstract ideal that Domota embodies. One could read lianage operating here in multiple ways. In one sense, it stands as a new call for unity among Guadeloupean people, a Guadeloupean version of the out of many one nationalist credo, for example. However, in the case of lianage, this sense of community does not require isolation or rupture. Instead, it recognizes the historical entanglement that Guadeloupe sustains with France, Europe, and the global economy, as represented by the €200 banknote, and thus speaks to a vision of sovereignty that is cognizant of the broader world within which Guadeloupeans seek to find their place. At present, it is still unclear what the long-term impact of the LKP strike will be. Although activists were able to sign historic agreements with employers, elected officials, and government representatives on 165 points of negotiation, these agreements have not been fully implemented. 4 years after the general strike, many participants feel disappointed by the gains of the movement. However, the fact remains that the LKP and its leaders have become important emblems of hope for social transformation in Guadeloupe. In a place where the traditional political formulas of independence and departmentalization had lost their promise, the LKP sparked hope in an alternative model. As Raymond Gama, one of the spokespersons for the movement, explains, "We are creating something that has already been promised but has never been seen. Only we can imagine it because we feel it, we live it, even if we don't have the concepts with which to describe it. Perhaps if people like myself," and this is Gama speaking, "perhaps if people like myself, intellectuals, took the time to reflect, they could find something. But right now, the only slogan we have is independence. That is why we don't cling to it, because we know it is empty. You can have independence and be dans la mer. That is why we are not committed to any slogan. We are committed to life. We want to transform our lives, even if it's under the French flag. The nationalists were guided by one single idea, not a desire for social change, but a desire for the nation. We do not cling to the nation. We want sovereignty, but only if it comes with social transformation." Gama's words trace the contours of an emergent, non-sovereign political imagination. They signal, on the one hand, a profound disenchantment with the categories of Western nationhood and sovereignty, and an acute awareness of the failures of political independence across and beyond the Caribbean. However, despite being rooted in disenchantment, his words also index a hope that social change and political transformation for Guadeloupe is possible, even if it is under the French flag. Thank you.
So we're going to start with Kaiama.
Right. Thank you, Gary, for issuing all of those disclaimers. So I don't have to issue them myself. I have agreed to go first as an attempt to mask some of my ignorance about these things. I'm a self-acknowledged literary person in principle, so I feel a little bit out of my space in a sense, not entirely, but a little out of my space, which these very astute social scientists, and I've heard Mayanthi and Yarimar speak twice now on a different topic last week, and have been blown away, and really in both instances by the work that they're producing. So. I also took very seriously Gary's directive not to prepare a formal paper, so my notes look like this. I think I know what I'm doing, but just bear with me if I get lost in the morass of what I have in front of me. So I'll start. What I think I'll do is I'll start with Maya's paper, some reflections on that. So I am engaging with the papers and using the text as a literary person, and then sort of segue into some thoughts about Yari's paper. And then try to think about them together, all the while interjecting some questions and thoughts I had that came from their sort of performance of these papers that I'd only read before I was there. So I want to start with this question of politeness and decorum and appropriate behavior. That's kind of the foundation of what Maya offered as some reflections. And to think more about this really fascinating social phenomenon that she lays out, to the extent to which the othering process, which is the label I'll use for right now, is about the non-achievability of belonging and citizenship, right? The extent to which French belonging is purported to be contingent on a set of rules, a script, right? Behavioral practices, behaving well. But then the extent to which this has always been, obviously, the false promise of French republicanism for browner would-be citizens. This insistence, then, that the other de-emphasize her difference, while all the while insisting with equal vehemence on the immutability of that difference, right? So calling for a rejection of the things that make the other other, but then reminding the other constantly. And I think back, obviously, to the moment in the 1930s, for example, Césaire arriving in Paris and recognizing that this sort of lie of if you go to the right school and if you read the right writers, you're as French as we are, right? But that clearly being the immigrant experience, or the migrant experience to France all throughout its certainly 20th century, 21st century history. And then along with that, I wanted to think about the concomitant phenomenon of visibility and violence, according to which, really, I would say that to see a brown body is to fear it. To fear its rage, to fear its refusal in a certain sense, and to make of it, as I think Maya quotes in her paper, a cause for concern. Right? So that's positioning of the brown French, or the phenotypically othered French person being a source of terror or fear. So all this obviously leads to the creation of this impossible state of being that Maya very eloquently has formulated with this exquisite attention to detail of what language says in this Muslim French etiquette. And I really appreciated your carefulness with explaining how you came to that and what you're uncomfortable with about it and how it is something that actually maintains a tension that not resolving that tension is part of how it serves to identify in a way. And then I think Muslim French, yes, this is applying to a particular demographic, but it very much, to my mind, describes a number of communities that are put under the umbrella of the French Republic, and describes this unhomely condition of all non-Euro French citizens. And in reading the paper and thinking about her evocation brief of this term, the unhomely, which is translated into English as the uncanny, I just wanted to suggest also that we think about the fact that unhomely not only signifies the unhomed, obviously that's sort of, that clear connection, but if we go back to what Baba or Arendt say, it also signifies the unspeakable, right, and the in-between. And I think that element is very present in this notion of Muslim French as well. And so also considering, I'll use the temporality of what we're trying to do here and thinking about the ways in which we're thinking about the present and the future while trying to anchor in theoretical of the space, how postcolonial has been theorizing these realities and these relationships, not just now, but very much in the past. I realized that much of Mayanthi's paper made me think of the persistent usefulness of Fanon. And now I'm scared to talk about Fanon because I didn't realize about your two books, but I'm going to forge ahead anyway. You just correct me and that'll be part of the discussion. But the thing about the persistent usefulness of Fanon, and in some ways sort of the lamentably persistent usefulness of Fanon, right? The more things change, not so much. And the two big moments of Fanon, right? So on the one hand, this question of alterity and interpolation that you didn't talk about, unfortunately, so much, but that was, I thought, a brilliant moment of the paper. The idea of the hey you moment when directed at the other as being a form of the creation of a subject in a way that limits and defines problematically the other, right? And that, of course, brings us to Fanon's tiens, un nègre, maman regarde un nègre, j'ai peur, right? Look, a Negro, mama, look, a Negro, I'm afraid. So that being in there, but then also thinking about the idea of impoliteness as somehow being on a continuum with the Fanonian notion of violence, right? And in his response to the dehumanizing of Arab Algerians in the 1950s and 1960s. So impoliteness being maybe an attenuated form of violence, but still being on this continuum of what it is about the browner body or about the other that inspires fear, that makes it a cause for concern. Right, so far, I'm following my lead. Good. Okay, and then it also makes me, your paper also made me think about Saidiya Hartman's analysis of the role of coerced or complicit performance in the process phenomenon of subjection, right? So the creation, the externally generated construction of subjugated subjecthood, and how that issue is also implicated in the ways, in the public performances of Muslim Frenchness, and those public performances as resistances to phenomenon of subjection. And then also, and I guess to some extent these are maybe also references for you in thinking through your work, but more recent texts like Kenan Ferguson's 2011 book with Duke, actually, All in the Family on incommensurability and community, which proposes in a really fine and I think quite brilliant way the absolute necessity of moving away from political and cultural models of normative unity and homogeneity, models that persist actually in even the most ostensibly multi-culti, post-racial, pluralistic national context like the US, right? We still believe in community and sort of the coherence of political ideals. And Ferguson in this All in the Family book problematizes the idea that in order to be in community we have to be aligned or alike in the way that we think about who we are and what we want. And then the question, of course, though, is but how do you do that? How does community function without unity? And it's not a rhetorical question, but it's a reiteration of the question you also asked in the written version of this paper. How do you operationalize, right, a political project capacious citizenship. And I love this idea of capacious citizenship. But what my intervention would be with respect to this notion of capacious citizenship in a national context is a wondering about whether or not there's at the root of this a broader questioning of whether human belonging itself needs to be considered in a nationalist context alone, right? So if some of the things that you're talking about could actually be expanded beyond France to think about a real utopian project, an imagining of non-circumscribed, non-community-based, fluid belonging to the wider human community in a sense. I don't know if this is starting to sound a little too hippy-dippy or what have you, but it's kind of a tapping into Glissant's notion of opacity in a sense, but the opacity of the individual, not the opacity of a brown person or a black person or an Antillean or a Muslim or what have you, but the opacity of each individual to the other. The opacity of the individual that allows for sort of multiple social, historical, cultural, political, sexual, ideological, and other spaces of belonging. And thus, that being the way in which we belong to the whole world, in a sense, right, from this position of multiplicity. And that's obviously, that's relation to me in some sense. And Glissant is throughout your paper in his language, though his name isn't evoked. But as soon as you started talking about wholeness and wholeness versus oneness and pluralism, obviously, and to me that screams the idea of relation, right? The particularity of a population, but I'm arguing the particularity even of an individual, like Younes, for example, who as an individual has defined his belonging as being multiple, right? And that being kind of utopian to my mind. Because while it often seems that communities of all stripes, even the most progressive, tend to resist capaciousness, we all know very well that individual consciousness is breathtakingly capable of maintaining tensions that don't end up being contradictions, right? And that don't have to be pathologized or don't have to be turned into schizophrenia. We can be multiple, whereas communities sometimes seem that they can't. Right. So it wasn't Younes, it was Fahim maybe, who was describing those of his generation who have particularized their relationship to their parents' homeland and to France. And so I thought that your concept of Muslim French itself was an example of mutable, discontinuous community. And this comment that you made in speaking about Farid, and then your later comments on Younes and his bridging of political alliances despite some of the particularities of his non-alignment, right, regarding homosexuality in particular. This also brought me back to Ferguson's idea of incommensurability as not a hindrance to collective political action. That one can identify punctually, right, and very specifically with a political idea in ways that don't elide one's difference. And this is the idea, obviously, that connects, I think, to Yari's paper as well. And I learned a lot from your paper, I have to say, and it makes me think differently about work I'm doing on community myself. Because, well, on the surface, obviously, the content or the context of your two papers are very different. These issues of belonging and non-belonging and hierarchical citizenship undergird both of your discussions. And obviously this idea that incommensurable community doesn't signal political immobility is incredibly important to what you're saying. Because I think what you're finding in Guadeloupe too is not only offer clear evidence of the political possibility that's embedded in heterogeneous coalition, but also you undermine, these phenomena undermine the situation by which I think engagement in the French-speaking Caribbean it often subtly insists on coherence. You know, if you're thinking from like the négritude to antillanité to créolité, there's this sort of progressive narrative of coherence that determines how to be political and resistant in the French-speaking Caribbean vis-a-vis France at particular periods in its history. And this is something that I think about in the literary context, and I have in my first book definitely. But taking it into the more explicitly political context, I think, is incredibly helpful. And so what I was interested in having you think further about is the political impact of embracing pluralism as a new model for rhizomatic decentralized engagement that travels out of the Caribbean and actually sets up possibilities for politics beyond that particular space. And you do that to an extent when you invoke Barack Obama and this is go to page B, which I don't know what that means. Barack Obama and you know the iconography and the marketing swag that went around his campaign. But I want to know, how useful do you see this model in other contexts? Like the Guadalupe model is an extraordinary example of its functionality in principle, but then as you acknowledge, not all of it sort of turned into what they had hoped it would be. Right? So I wonder if, what you think now about the model of political incoherence being a strategy for resisting the status quo. Okay. And then I wanted to think almost in that same vein, though it's not explicitly evoked in your paper, something about the legitimacy, the possible legitimacy of silence, abstention, and willful non-participation as forms of resistance with respect to a dominant order. I mean, are those also alternative models for misbehaving, being impolite? Let's see. Okay. All right. Okay. Because in the othered French communities that you both describe, I think that there is actually, just going back to this idea of a phenomenon and fear and violence. I want to argue that there is a threat implicit in the construction of these French citizen selves, be it the Muslim French or the Guadeloupans, but it's a threat that doesn't come from their bodies, but that comes from their discourse and their minds, and it's a threat and a reminder, to some extent, of France's indebtedness to its putatively former colonies, and that you got to a bit when you showed that brilliant slide about how much Guadeloupe or the dom-toms are costing France, but in fact, how much France owes to those spaces. And it's a threat, I think, that was issued, moving temporally, going back to this temporality, moving into the past, not just to Fanon, but also to Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism in the 1950s. That threat he issues at this particularly vulnerable post-World War II moment, suggesting that the no longer margins are speaking differently and on different terms to the no longer center that France thought and thinks it is. And a threat that doesn't seek to reverse the poles of the hierarchy, but to do away with the hierarchy altogether, and to really suggest that the center is not going to hold for much longer. This idea that France has to assume its destiny, as you said. Right? And to me, just in reading both of these papers, I kept thinking in my head, this is what Césaire was suggesting, and this is what Fanon was arguing as well, and threatening. Yes, get it together, France. Things are changing, whether you like it or not, and so you need to figure out who and how you want to be in this new world that we are making.
Thank you.
So now I get the whole, you don't want to follow. And I'm also really grateful that you actually did mention Fanon, because when you're working on a particular project and you I was going to mention Fanon, and I was afraid that the Fanon guy. So
I have your back.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you so much. We set that up. But more seriously, also because I love the way you sort of address each of the papers. And what I was thinking more was I was going to touch on a few points of what I saw as points of connection between the papers, and then one or two kind of points of divergence. I'm not going to get you guys to argue necessarily, but I mean sort of points of divergence, and then a couple of questions. But I need to say first, both these papers are deeply exciting. And open all sorts of doors for future conversations. I think this is one of those, but I think there's a lot more conversations. They both introduce, generally speaking, underrepresented sites of analysis and voices in the field of postcolonial studies. And what I really appreciated also was, both papers keep coming back to the idea that they're talking about a kind of ongoing set of conditions and circumstances and conjunctures, and we don't necessarily have, even the actors themselves involved are saying we don't have the vocabulary, and yet you guys do actually start to give us a provisional vocabulary, which I think is really important. And in particular, I haven't met you guys before, so I'm gonna call you very formative. But in Mayanthi Fernando's paper, this notion of capacious citizenship, which I loved. I mean, even more than the notion of impolite citizenship, this notion of kind of capaciousness within citizenship. This notion of the creolization, which, at one point you described it, I don't know if you said it as clearly in this version, but the creolization of France, right, in a statement like France is mon bled, right? I mean, and the way that actually, and you talked about the longer version of that, that becomes an identity that's not only claimed by, for example, North African or Muslim French. It begins to sort of spread beyond that. And even the term Muslim French itself, I think, which is such a useful way of starting to think through the complexities of identity that you're describing. And then Yarimar, Bonilla, I mean, in your paper, besides the very notion of non-sovereignty itself, which is huge, and there's this idea of theorizing non-sovereignty not as pathological or, as you say, underdeveloped, or that scary map with the blood red sea. But also, at one point you use the phrase strategic entanglement to sort of describe, like the rejection of certain kinds of like reform or certain kinds. I mean, instead, like opting, like the no vote, for example, like actually opting for a kind of strategic entanglement with the metropolitan center. This notion of like of a kind of poetic politics, which I thought was like fascinating. And of course, Lienage itself, which you put forward, towards the end, I think. You correct me if I'm wrong, but I start to get the sense that this is a different version of sovereignty, is embedded in this notion of Lienage, right? I mean, as a way of getting out of this like sovereignty versus non-sovereignty, bind. And in both papers, just this open-ended view of futurity, which is a term that both papers are coming back to. The notion of futurity as open-ended, as full of possibilities, new alternatives, new political horizons. Which is not the way necessarily a lot of us walk around thinking about politics at this particular moment. So I think opening out onto those horizons. I also appreciated the way both these papers in different ways place the sites and the movements that they were describing, both spatially and temporally. They're both in space and time. And I mean, I will now begin to call you by your first name. I mean, Mayanthi.
I think we're all ready.
So, I mean, Mayanthi, I mean, in your paper specifically, I love the way you place it in terms of generations, right? I mean, generations within the kind of the story of Muslim French. And, this notion of the immigrant who's not an immigrant, I mean, in particular, I think is really useful. And describing, as a result, describing this as kind of historicist, futurist project. In some ways, all I'm doing right now is just footnoting things. These are important things that I would like us to continue to talk about for the next several years. But even that notion of a historicist, futurist project, I think is really rich, and I'm going to come back to that. And then Yarimar, I mean, what I really appreciated again was trying to place these in terms of other contemporary uprisings, and thinking about the Occupy movement, and thinking about the Arab Spring, and this maybe as a precursor to, or beginnings of, or somehow sort of working alongside that. And I want to come back to that too, because I think there's a complexity there. A third really suggestive thing, and this I really want to open out in terms of the sort of topic itself, is that both these papers, I think, are marking or moving towards an after moment. Right, I mean, after sovereignty in one case, and I really kind of want to say, Anthony, in terms of your paper, after France, I almost want to say, I mean, that it's marking that kind of after, or looking towards that moment, and I think this is particularly useful for postcolonial studies, which of course, in its very name, is trying to mark an after, which is either spatial or temporal or whatever, and hasn't always done a very good job of that, but I think the most important theorist, and somebody like Fanon is at the forefront of this, is really trying to think not only what's after colonialism, but what's after post-colonialism, right? Which is very much where Fanon's work lands. I think very often it gets read simply in this kind of symptomatic way, see, he was right, Africa will be a disaster, this will happen, and, he was correct in his kind of negative diagnosis. I mean, Said gets read the same way, oh yeah, Oslo will fall apart. But the real theorization is okay, we know that's going to happen, and then what's after that, right? So and I think both these papers are trying to get us towards that after moment. which I think for the field is so crucial. I'm going to skip that, but I'll just sort of say I also felt like both these papers, you know, deconstruction has gotten such a bad name through like just sheer overuse and, you know, a Top Chef, like everything is like a deconstructor. But I really felt like these two papers like were practicing deconstruction in like in the true sense, right? I mean, in terms of a real kind of taking apart in the name of reconfiguration, reimagining, like, you know, I mean, that what's really going on in the Declaration, you know, there is no France in a certain kind of way, which is sort of what I read as sort of going through your paper. There is no sovereignty, there is no independence, right? Which is not, and not just resting there, as work sometimes tends to do, like sort of in a satisfied way. Like, see, I have taken apart the notion that there's a unified French identity, and now we can stop there. Sort of like that as a first move towards this kind of reconfiguration, I think you both want us to think about. Now I come to my questions. And the first of those questions actually, Yarimar, in terms of your paper, actually comes around this, because when I was writing this, I was thinking, there is no sovereignty, there is no independence. And then I stopped and I sort of thought, there's a way within your argument that those two words sometimes become interchangeable in a way that I wanted to push you on a little bit more. Like, is sovereign, like, and actually it's kind of sovereignty, independence, and actually freedom at certain points becomes a third term. And I think, you know, again, especially, I mean, historically or otherwise, like that question, like, it has always been a question in some ways, is sovereignty and independence, right? I mean, political, even what is independence? Is that political independence? Is that, you know, a more, you know, individual independence? So, like, you know, where, so just kind of taking apart some of those terms and disaggregating sovereignty, independence, freedom. I think I want to push you guys both on a little bit is around the new sets of political formations / coalitions / movements that you're both, you know, sort of pointing us towards, which again is so rich and so suggestive and important. And one thing, I mean, and I may be making too much of this, but at the end of your paper you come to this notion of sort of unit, or not at the end, I think it's the end of the written version, but in this version it's more in the middle, talking about lineage as a kind of unity, right? Or like unity and different, but nevertheless a unity. And Mayanthi, of course, you want us to kind of do this thing of sort of maybe not unity but wholeness, right? So I was sort of curious if there's a distinction there that's worth, you know, sort of following through. And I guess and I'll say it this way, I don't know how else to say it, that I wasn't totally satisfied in either paper with the notion of kind of the newness of the kind of coalition politics that was sort of showing up in both examples, which is not a criticism, because I mean, I think the papers are doing a lot of different things. But really, again, I mean, you know, I kept thinking about, you know, Judith Butler has the thing where she talks about coalition politics as, and I think this is, you know, especially true, Mayanthi, in terms of your paper, again, you do this really nice job of taking apart this notion of identity as this kind of stable, or, you know, the whole Charles Taylor. So happy that one. Trust me, I was really grateful for that bit. But Butler got this thing where she sort of says, you know, like, so we reach that point and then we go into coalition politics, and in a certain kind of way, the very notion of coalition politics, even though maybe it comes out of this notion of more fluid identity, like starts to reinscribe those, right? And in this sort of way of like, you know, she has a great part where she sort of says, it's like, it's the et cetera, right? This coalition, you know, represents a movement against, you know, racism, you know, capitalism, sexism, you know, and then at the end it sort of has to say, except, you know, sort of, there's always like you know, the thing that it can't name, because it can't name everything, right? But so, you know, what's the difference in the kind of coalition politics you're talking about here? The limitations of citizenship, because in a sense both, you know, both these papers rely to some extent on kind of stretching the citizen, sort of the notion of citizenship. And I think I'm very sympathetic to that, but are there kind of limitations to the notion of citizenship? And I think this would apply especially to politics of France around immigration, politics of anywhere around immigration, right? I mean, the question of sort of citizen, non-citizen. Yeah, and I guess in general, and again, I think this probably is more with Mayanthi's paper, but, and this is my final moment, I mean, you know, thinking about, and again, in the longer version of the paper, you have a long section kind of on interpolation, right? I think this is, you know, back to your point about the visibility, like the visibility of race. You also have a section of the paper which I was sorry not to hear. We talked about one, I can't remember her name, but one particular interlocutor who talks about, who talks about her experience of racism in France, and in some ways her experience of France as hostile, like in a sense, you know, when she's elsewhere, she actually feels the lack of that hostility as a kind of, I'm away from home, right? So, you know, Fanon has a place in Black Skin, White Mass where he basically says no ontology is possible in the racist and colonial context. Like essentially ontology itself becomes impossible. And I guess, you know, I wanted to hear a little bit more about what happens to the notion of identity in both of you guys' cases, you know, in the coalition models you're talking about. I mean, do we have to sort of go back to work on the very notion of identity itself, right, as part of that coalition politics? I think I also want, and this is not just you guys, all of us, what's the relationship in the work we're talking about here, and all of us are talking about, between, let's call it a politics of like recognizing like kind of contemporary conjuncture versus naming that conjuncture, which is already like, you know, and you guys are starting to do that, versus creating that conjuncture, which again, I think in both papers, there's this movement between those things. It would be interesting, I think, to kind of draw out, you know, what's the particular work of like recognizing, for example, the situation versus naming the situation. And that's probably maybe where aesthetics comes into play, for example, which I loved in your paper, where it sort of talks about the kind of poetic moment. I don't know if this applies, but there were moments where I felt like, in addition to the potential limits of citizenship, and again, this is a question I think from postcolonial studies more generally, like what are the limits of like a certain kind of regionalism that sometimes creeps in. You know, there are moments. There are moments where this notion, like for example, like the notion of like placing, you know, North Africa next to France, and that gives us a certain kind of cosmopolitics, right? But that's not the same as placing North Africa next to Egypt, or placing North Africa in like an African country, right? So in other words, like when one like sort of Mediterranean-ness, right, as a kind of regional identity, as a way of getting out of national identity, how does that cut us off from like other kinds of regional possibilities? Orhan Pamuk actually has a great little essay on like how to become Mediterranean, where he sort of like takes apart this notion of like Mediterranean. And I was thinking the same in terms of the kind of, again, I think it's super interesting the way you give us this Caribbean topography of non-sovereignty. And again, instead of, you know, again, I mean, like that, instead of that kind of horrible map of like good states and bad states, you know, sort of, here's a notion, like, you know, here's a kind of, I almost want to say like archipelago of non-sovereignty. But then that leads me to the question, okay, if you also want to make linkages to things like the Occupy movement, Arab Spring, right? I mean, how does that happen across those different, you know? And I think you're onto something really suggestive in this notion of like not seizing state power, you know, a movement that's around, you know, keywords like dignity, right? I mean, like, you know, these sorts of things definitely turn up in all those movements. Yeah, I have a thing, I'll skip that, maybe I'll save it for later. But the last thing I guess I want to ask, because I think it's related to that, is like what constitutes success for these movements? And like Marina's not here. I feel like that's a question I associate with her, and that like I sort of permanently have in my head because of her. But like, what would success look like in terms, for example, of like reconstituting identity in France, in terms of, you know, the particular kind of struggles in Guadeloupe, like what would, you know, and what's the role of cultural theory, you know, in that work? Because again, I mean, at the end of the day, I feel like the work that you guys are doing, which again is a kind of like prescriptive work, a descriptive work, has a role. But I mean, how do we place that within the notion of like success and the kind of cultural politics you guys are doing? So I love these papers. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. First of all, I want to thank you both for your papers in a very selfish way. You relieved a great deal of anxiety on my part because I've been a discussant in so many times where I've had to be a discussant of a miserable paper. And I would appreciate the fact that both of yours are really quite excellent. So I don't think that should be it. I think
they are also excellent. Not only are they excellent, but they're very provocative, and I think that's important. They have to be read that way. Let me just say that they seems to both of them have three levels. One is the substantive level, in a very specific way about the state of the situation of the Muslim French, Caribbean, Guadeloupeans. The other is an institutional level. We're talking about colonialism, post-colonialism, etc. And the third is the political futures. And I don't think that what has interested me about these was the fact that these three different levels in both your papers, and inevitably, I think, are incommensurable. Let me say that as I often do when I read a paper or book, I write down feeling thoughts. And these that went through as I read this was cynicism, irony, pathos, hope, irrealism, powerlessness, and the powerless empowered, powerlessly empowered. And I think these come up more not in the papers themselves as they do in the substantive level, particularly when it turns to the futurity. I think we have to look at this from the point of view, very definitely, of the kinds of issues that come up in these papers as these people who you're talking about, who are not you, however you may sympathize with them or not sympathize with them. Nevertheless, there is created in me a certain kind of cynicism about this and a certain pathos, because there was so much there in notions of hope and possibility, and yet so much about our own experience, and certainly my experience, even dealing with Africa over quite a long time now, seeing the way in which changes don't happen. And you brought that up, Yarimar, at the end, and I think that's there. And I think that the motivation for so much of this intellectualization, if I can call it, of the political situation relates to an underlying realism that demands a kind of cynicism, and I won't say despair because that would be too strong, but I would say something that's less than hopeful. And sometimes it is despair. I don't want to deny that either. Now, as far as I saw this, and let me see, I think I've got the wrong sheet. Well, anyway, it doesn't matter. I'll just talk off the cuff, which I usually do anyway. I think that I apologize because I know far less about the Caribbean than I do about France and North Africa. The first thing I want to say is something about language, which has been in all these papers. What is the language which we can use? Now, this operates at many different levels. One of them is naming. But I think we have to question the role of naming. Why is naming so important? And yet it is important within these relationships. And it always presents a paradox. If you look at the Algerian situation alone, you see that there are enormous changes. In 1930 in France, if you said Algerian, you were talking about what today would be the colonists. The Algerians were indigènes. If you look at the ways in which the French over the years were troubled with how do you name these people, and it switches again and again. You mentioned this. At one level, I think I would recommend that you also include all the slang and terms that are used. They're very, very important. And they change over time. You can use the word French Muslim or Muslim French or any of the other sorts of things, d'origine this and d'origine that, so on and so forth. But underlying it all, there is also that bedrock reality that is captured by the derogatory terms that are used. And I think it's very, very important to consider that. But I'd like to say more important is the question of nominalization itself. We talk about otherness and self and other, but we don't talk that much about nominalization and what that means at a meta level. Why should you be named? It's always been, so that's one thing that I think is important to consider. but also the attitudes towards these terms. Take the word bled. Now, bled is a very interesting word because, in one way, it fits more closely than just about so many other Arabic words to the notion of pays in France, mon pays, which the French use. Now, I remember when bled was used ironically by the French. It wasn't just a nice word that you used. It was a borrowed word. And there was an ironic twist in it, mon pays, mon bled. And I think it's important to see that process going on. There's a historical process that goes on there. As far as Muslim French is concerned, I appreciate, and I think most importantly, is that you bring up that you're using it, recognizing full well that it has its limitations, and it certainly does. But I think it's very important to realize also that it's a globifying term. And what has interested me about a lot of post-colonial studies is the way they are, and certainly in these papers, is there's a way in which North Africa becomes the place. But if you live in France or anywhere else, you know there are an awful lot of non-North African Muslims. And they've had a different role. They're treated differently in different ways. And indeed, what's happening in Mali today is significant in that respect. There are very subtle different attitudes. Plus the fact, even the word Maghrébin, North African, is a globalizing term, which is failing to realize at the emic level, on the subjective level of the people of North Africa, of the Maghreb, there are important differences that are there. There are the differences between the Berbers and the Arabs, clearly, the Kabyle and the. But there are also other kinds of differences that are being played there, and they're exclusivist in many ways. The Tunisians certainly don't want to be called Moroccans, and in the research that I was doing on the Harki, which we will not talk about, I was constantly being told by people when I asked about things like drug addiction, and these were Algerians, obviously, or Algerian origin. Oh, that's the Moroccans who are doing this. So that there is a tension there that has to be seen. These can't just simply be collapsed in there. And I think it's necessary to mention that in somewhat greater detail. And let me turn to Sayad. I am not quite the fan that people are of Sayad. I liked him very much. I knew him a little bit. I knew he was there was a colonial relationship ever there was between him and Bourdieu, who was one of the great colonialists. But it seems to me that Sayad talking about the absence, the double absence, is an interesting moment, but it also, there is also the double présence, the double presence. And that has always been there as well. Now, this politeness has to be conceived of at the time that he wrote. It was after he was working with Bourdieu. It was after the Algerian War. Thinking just of the Algerians in France during that period of time, it was a very, very difficult one. Remember, 5,000 French were killed in the Café Wars alone. This was still in their memory. The Algerian War itself was in their memory. And more than that was the enormous amount of black labor. Many of the Algerians who came were being paid wages that were disgustingly low. And they were being paid this way, frankly, because they knew if they protested in any way, that is to say, became impolite, they'd be sent back. Now that, to a certain extent, ended. You don't have that kind of black labor in the quantity it had. The French became more serious about it. That isn't to say that there aren't problems about work, but it is a slightly different tone. And I think it's important to realize that we have to see this politeness as also the invisibility itself was being forced upon them. My own experiences at the time, to be truthful, were really related to things like being in Paris during some of these wars, these cafe wars, and being on in the most fashionable section of Paris one day, where a bunch of police came up and attacked and kicked and practically killed, and 2 or 3 Arab boys who were standing there, and they were doing nothing. They were just talking to them. And, they needed a victim, or at least that's one way of putting it. But there was a nervousness. At the same time, I remember a discussion I had with a taxi driver when we got stuck in proverbial French traffic. And he was telling, this was in the 1990s, and he was telling me that he had come to France in 1946. He was living a good life. He had his home out in the suburbs, not the banlieue, but the more expensive suburbs, and so on and so forth. And his children had gone to college, but he had one daughter whom he was sending back to Algeria, and this was during the war. And I said to him, why are you doing that? Now this was not, he was not, we had been joking about drinking wine and so on, so this was not somebody who was listening. He said, because during the time of the Algerian War and afterward, we knew who we were. We definitely knew who we were. Now, it's all double talk. You don't know who we are. And I think that's extremely important to understand in terms of who we are. It's not a question of an identity. It's a question of how that identity is articulated, what role it plays within people's lives. And I think that's important to consider. I think, by the way, I want to congratulate you on your comments, by the way, on Charles Taylor's, what I call soft Hegelianism. It's quite amazing sometimes to consider symptomatically the way that soft Hegelianism became very popular, because it's easy. And it's easy for us as well as it is for anybody else. And I think we have to be much, much harsher about this. Now, as far as the question of the movement in Guadeloupe, I'm a little concerned about a paradox that seems to be there. Obviously, a paradox in terms of disunity and unity, and obviously the contrast between the Muslim French in France and then the Guadeloupeans in Guadeloupe. I wonder what it would be like among Guadeloupeans living in France. But I think it's important to realize what the nature of this movement is, because on the one hand it reflects our problem, which we're really suffering in the social sciences, in my view anyway, is that we don't know how to deal with social movements. We absolutely don't have the vocabulary. We had a vocabulary of social movements that was so damn integrated within the kind of capitalist structure that we had, a social structure, that we keep imposing it. We want to have a leader. We want the leader to speak, and so on. And therefore, I think you have to be a little bit careful about equating what was going on in Guadeloupe with the Motu and so on the one hand, and what was going on in some of these other movements where there's been not to have a leader, not to have a platform that was very, very specific. I think that's an extremely important aspect to see it. I remember back in I don't remember, but I was told that back in some theorists, some social theorists in the 1950s came up with the idea that what we really needed was to use meteorological models for understanding. And he spoke about clouds and storms. And they're not bad. Of course, that was immediately wiped out, given the academic censorship, if I can put it that way. Now, there are a couple of things that I do want to say about this question of language itself. A couple of things I do want to say also about the question of the protest movement itself. What struck me about the protest movements was not only the discourse, but how French they were. How the French have achieved over a very long time a style and schedule, if you will, a yearly schedule of protest movements, almost to the point that they nullify. They happen in the spring when the weather's better, for example, in Paris. And people know that. I've talked to actually people in unions who have told me, oh yeah, we always do that in the spring. There's a certain cynicism involved, and there's a certain conventionality of response, which again is the same entrapment that you find inevitably, and I don't say there's a solution to it, as with the nominalization. You find a kind of entrapment within modes of discourse, modes of protest, and modes of action. And I think it's important to realize that the contradiction that occurs within these. It's very difficult to sort these things out. Finally, as far as that list that I gave of sentiments that I was going through really reflects what I think is most interesting about the papers, in which you are the ventriloquists. And I hate to displace you, but what I thought was most interesting in both papers is what the people whom we were dealing with were saying and conceptualizing. I was sorry that I didn't know more about them, but of course, these are papers. But I think it was very important to see that this idea that you call non-sovereignty, nevertheless, is a term that you're using for a situation which is very, very complex. And the fact that people can say, independence, don't believe in it. At the same time, they're using independence, and then they go on to say almost immediately, they switch it to economic independence. There's a kind of twist there that I think is important. That's where, questions of powerlessness and pathos and so on come in. What is stuff in many ways? I think the same thing is true of these notions of the future. Now, what I thought was very interesting about them was the open-endedness. I think that's extremely interesting. I think the temporality of thought is extremely interesting. It's a very, very different temporality in both descriptions, whether Guadeloupean or the French, the Muslim French that you're talking about. Their political understanding was distinctly temporal, in the sense, whether it be the media, you mentioned about the media and this process going on, and the whole question of temporality and media on the one hand, but on the other hand, the idea of ad hocism, and then again, the idea of not fixing the political terms in any way. Related to this, and I'll stop here, are three things. The first is the importance of difference and indifference, which has to be conceived of also within a temporal framework. And it's both at a very general historical level and at a very situational level. When do you want indifference? When don't you want indifference? And when are you speaking about indifference in bad faith? A term that is important. That seemed to me to be one thing. The second thing seemed to me to be the fact that that there was a sense in which I'm losing the question of capaciousness, which I think is a wonderful term. I think the question of whole versus and metaphors of wholeness versus unity are interesting insofar as they go. But I think that in a way still there is a way in which all of this is being articulated within a kind of colonialist, post-colonialist discourse. And the question that I kept feeling was, I'd like to know more about how the people whom you're talking about, who are obviously both of your groups are privileged people. They're not the ordinary people you see in a little workers' cafe somewhere who are just, who are not educated and probably jobless and so on and so forth, whose vocabulary can be quite different. And it can vary tremendously regionally. I mean, I've spent time in Cartier in Arles, for example, where you had African and North African and people living together, and along with workers, and where this area was characterized, there was not any manifest prejudice whatsoever. All there was a simple fact that all of us were poor, as opposed to the isolation in many of the banlieues in Paris, or the forced isolation in the HLM, for example, the housing districts and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that there's a lot there that needs to be elaborated in terms of the down-to-earth level, and the way in which some of this upper sort of intellectualized understanding, this post-colonial perspective, filters down, is parochialized as you move down. And sometimes with quite, and I'll end with this, sometimes with quite extraordinary sense. I was talking to one woman who refuses to use the word Bled when she talks about France, and she rarely uses mon pays. She speaks of ma terre, my land, my earth. Now, that's not something, I think what she was trying to do there is to capture the materiality of the situation in which these people are living. So these are some of the perspectives that I think, probably some of them you probably cover in your book, and some of them merit discussion. But I would hate to see that our discussion remains, and both of you have avoided this, but remains at the highfalutin level of post-colonial studies, which in a way has to be seen also as a gesture of avoidance and deflection.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have a handout with a poem on it. And I hope that you guys won't, will take my discussion of this kind of prolonged tangent as a tribute to the way in which you kind of inspired my poetic and political imagination, rather than a gesture of avoidance. And the translation that I did of this, when I realized that I had to translate because I couldn't assume that it was a little rapid, so forgive. And in the interest of time, I'm going to just skip over. I have a little, sort of, I'm a French historian, historian of France and the French Empire, and I had a little discussion of the kind of history of the relationship between the nation and French ideas of sovereignty that I'm just going to bracket. But what I'll just try to work in a little bit of that. So I think that what's so wonderful about reading and listening to your papers together is how they articulate the urgency of rethinking the idea of France. And I say this not as a French historian, I mean, although I am, who by professional deformation has an inflated sense of the importance of what one of Yari's interlocutors, Lucas, describes as a little country like France. It's rather, I think, as you both point out, because France is no longer what it once thought itself to be, and I thought it was amazing. You had a phrase in your own comments that were almost identical to that phrasing, which I wrote out, right, that France is no longer what it once thought itself to be, which doesn't mean that it actually was, but it's just no longer what it once thought itself to be. It nonetheless, ironically, remains for this very reason very good to think with, right? So now I'm going to bracket the extended discussion that I had of Article 3 of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, to now move forward to pointing to how, I mean, we know that, in French history, this legacy of the linking together of the nation and popular sovereignty as once grounded telos existed not just for itself, but also for others, right? So hence the narrative of independence, self-determination, et cetera, right? So as your papers, for me, so nicely demonstrate, or you so nicely illustrate how this hallowed principle of the linkage between the nation and sovereignty, self-determination, produced the historical contradictions of national sovereignty that actually persist into our present. And your both historically informed readings of our present explain as well how these by no means novel contradictions have been aggravated by new global pressures, right? So this is not, you're not making arguments of, it's always been exactly the same, right? You're also attentive to what the kind of, what is it about this our current conjuncture, right? Both from within and without, that actually test this foundational fantasy of of national sovereignty. At the same time, what I'd read you both as doing is also reversing the post-colonial melancholia of waning sovereignty, right, which Jared, you invoke quite explicitly. You instead seek to document and conjure what Mayanthi describes as a new political imagination for the future, one that emerges out of the historical and contemporary realities of France. And I think when you invoke here France, it's precisely in this kind of deconstructed notion of France that your projects both elaborate. So in trying to think about the way in which both of you go about doing this, I just kind of popped up as an image in my mind, and also a kind of auditory resonance, a poetic event that occurred a month ago. This was during the recent deliberations surrounding the passage of marriage equality legislation in France, when Justice Minister and former deputy from Guyane, right, Christine Taubira, cited the Guyanese poet Léon Gautran Damas in the conclusion to her discourse introducing the new law, right? And there was quite a bit of discussion of the fact that she did this, right? And I, read a lot of the press, and I was, kind of. There was something about this moment that was quite extraordinary, but it was actually after reading your papers that it helped me to think about what the significance of that gesture was in a whole new way. The poem, and this is the poem that I've given you a copy of that she cited, is grand comme un besoin de changer d'air, right, or large as the need to change the scenery, large as the need for a change of scenery. It kept returning in my mind as I was reading your papers, right? This figuration of a Caribbean poetic need on the floor of the National Assembly resonated really with, Jari, your account of how poetry itself was imagined as an urgent necessity in the movement that you're describing, right? Explicitly in their account of the urgent necessity, right? And of course, as many of you know, right, Damas figures prominently in Gary's own account of the imminent contradictions of republicanism, and so knowing that I was going to be, reading or thinking about these papers out loud, so that I was just kind of all came together, right? So Taubira's work of poesis, that is to say, her attempt to kind of create a new political imaginary for the republic, resonated strongly, both with Gary's project and with those that seem to be at the core of your papers, right? So what was striking about her intervention, I think, and here it's notable that President of the National Assembly, Claude Barthelon, actually described the moment as an encounter between justice and poetry. Right? That was the quote that he used at a slightly different moment, which I can talk about. So it was what I was striking about it was how Taubira remobilized Damas's poem in order to kind of enact precisely a sort of change of scenery, right? I mean, so it was really a kind of extraordinary performative gesture, not least by reminding the Assembly that Damas, in addition to being a poet, had actually served as one of them, right? And there was a kind of whole scandal because someone says, "Oh, well, bring him in," and like they didn't realize that, So Taubira's gesture was striking for how it conjured a vision of the Republic, which deconstructed some of France's most entrenched and iconic myths. Right? So she cites an excerpt from the poem from 1964 that proclaimed that marriage equality was beau comme, she actually skipped the second, comme une rose dont la tour Eiffel assiégée à l'aube voit s'épanouir les pétales. So beautiful as a rose, so that kind of double underlining of the simile is actually quite significant. But as a rose that the Eiffel Tower assaulted at dawn seized blossom. Right, so here we have a kind of Republican poetic insurgency, right? An assault not on the Ancien Régime Bastille, but rather on the 1889 symbol of the triumphant Republic, the Eiffel Tower. The assault is not with arms necessarily, but with rhetorical flowers. Right? So the poem proclaims proclaims the lyrics of once fragile and mighty power. The invocation of a natural figure, the rose, grows out of the soils. This actually goes back, it seems to me, to this idea of the terre, right? Out of the soil of the Republic, right? So very much kind of your argument as well is that these are kind of indigenous movements, right? Right, so it's the flower that is, that's on the ground, sur le terrain, right? More ephemeral, but also more universal, right? Not the kind of singular Eiffel Tower, but a rose. So more universal than that singular, iconic, rigid, and phallic symbol of the Imperial Republic, 1889, after all, right? It is already existing, but also just blossoming. But also a future, right? So she invoked the crossroads of a republic that is always, and at the same time remains to be born, right? So the poem is a string of similes that strikingly never names an original object or end, which I think also kind of resonates with this idea of the not fully determined object, right? So that it's, it's a kind of, it remains an unnamed but evoked, object of desire. So hovering between being and not, et ou pas, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, it refuses spatio-temporal fixity. No, I need to read this part because it actually explicitly invokes parts of her papers. So in reciting this poem in the assembly, Taubira created a republic as crossroads, it seems to me, right? In which the negritude poet expresses the achievement of marriage equality, right? Which was really what was so striking about the gesture, right? In doing so, she also enacted a change of scene or scenery, effectively disrupting expectations about identity and community, right? She didn't say gîte, right? Which was crucial. In her own poetic gesture, Taubira created a certain lionnage, right? I mean, a kind of explicit linking together, a solidarity in difference by reimagining the terms of Republican inclusion, right? So while Mayanthi's interlocutor, Eunice, might not embrace this particular constellation, it is nonetheless possible, as this comment suggests, that the idea of minimalist solidarity is not rejected out of hand, but it might nonetheless be worth talking about the overlaps and differences, it seems to me, between the respective ad hoc political formulations that both of you described. And I think this has come up in many of the questions posed by my fellow commentators. So to continue along my hopefully productive tangent, in a cynical and quite scandalous rejoinder to Taubira, the right-wing MP and serial offender Henri Mariton attempted to trip her up. I mean, it was just like so incredibly scandalous. And these moments I could send, they're available on YouTube, and they're just like, I think this is so outrageous. So he's like waving these Xerox copies of like the Damas poem in his hand. And he claimed that she had misinterpreted Damas, which is just like unbelievable, right? So he presumptively interrogated her appropriation of the poet. How, he wondered, could Damas, as an apostle of difference, be invoked to celebrate a law which sought to efface that most foundational difference of all, that of sex? Right, so he becomes a defender of difference, using Damas to defend difference because, he's, anti-marriage equality. So I'll not linger on the hypocrisy of Mariton's gesture. More important was Taubira's unbelievably amazing, indignant retort. Right, that difference was no justification for inequality, right? So this, I think, gets back to the indifference to difference point, right? That, and she went on to cite from memory another amazing poem. I mean, so this was not prepared remarks, like, just from memory. She's like, you want to talk Damas? So nous les gueux, right? So we, the downtrodden, by Damas, right? And she just, goes on for like 2 minutes. Totally incredible. Right, so Mariton's cynical intervention, to get back to this question of cynicism, whatever, right? It's paternalism, it's sexism, historical amnesia, homophobia. So this is what we have come to expect this, after so many years of Sarkozy, whatever. Right, so it reveals persistent French resistances to thinking France otherwise. But they also provide, this is my being, a hopeful optimist, which those of you who know me, it's not really my general mode of being. But they also provided a stage on which another vision of the Republic could be enacted and imagined. right? I mean, they actually provided the stage for Tobias to make this totally awesome intervention, right? I mean, so much so, right, that not unlike some of Jerry's characters, there are now T-shirts, right? There's like a whole Tobias T-shirt craze, right? And the YouTube clip and the whole thing, right? And as you can see, I'm obviously full participant in that band. If this figure of Tobias in the National Assembly calling forth Damas's Rose and the assault of Eiffel Tower returns so insistently in my mind, it is because it resonates with the historical and rhetorical force of the at once indigenous and new political figures described in both of your papers, right? The engagements of what I powerfully describe as Muslim French, and I love the work that you do with that, and what Jari, you figure to be the non-sovereignty of Léonage, seem to me to be just such flowers, right? These novel formations have emerged on the historical terrain of French Republican contradiction. In doing so, they together contest founding and foundational myths of sovereign monolithicity. I have maybe another 2 minutes. Okay, so as part of your critiques, both of you productively question a conceptual reliance on a model of, so this is part of the, where does this help post-colonial thinking? I think you both productively question the conceptual reliance on a model of post-colonial exceptionality, right? Or at least this is something that's particularly productive and helpful for me. So the model has evident seductions when trying to understand and reconcile official political and mythical discourses of universality with blatant legal and social discrimination, right? So how do you know? But reading your work together helps to illuminate precisely the limitations of that framework. I think for both of you, the language of the exception as a historical and geographical figure ultimately confirms the Schmittian fantasy of sovereignty that the mobilization of Muslim French and Léonage, I think, profoundly contest, and that's part of the work that you're, maybe I'm reading you wrong, but for you, Maya, it's neither historically accurate nor politically productive to single out Muslims, especially in the wake of decolonization, as constituting a novel historical problem for an otherwise coherently secular republic. For Jari, it is similarly problematic to imagine Guadeloupe as a political and historical aberration, caught in the not yet of its own self-determination. Following your interventions, we might say that rather than recognizing these differences, or their differences, in order to render them compatible to a mythic republican and national ideal, it is the always already fractured sovereignty of the republic that needs to be recognized as its own future possibility. The rose whose ephemeral future might outshine the Eiffel Tower. Right? So final set of questions. I guess what I'd like, to hear, you both speak to, and I think this resonates with some of the other questions raised by the other respondents, is how you understand the relationship between the already existing and not yet, right? Because I think that this is a set of questions that traverses both of your papers, and if you just could sort of expand on that, right? Something that I'm suggesting we can sort of sense in this figure of the rose in the poem. And then, is it possible to imagine an ad hoc solidarity between Mayanthi's French Muslims and Jari's activists? How can we articulate both the connections and specificity of their histories, as well as their possible collective futures? But then I also wonder whether that's the wrong question to ask, right? To what extent that actually remains overly, too much precisely within a kind of French framework, right? Is that me, my kind of, French historian despite myself, whatever, kind of re-ascribing or attempting to, assert the persistence of the Eiffel Tower beyond the Eiffel Tower. So I think I'll just stop there. But thank you guys for making me think.
Thank you all so much. This would not be the first time I was overly ambitious about what we could accomplish in a given amount of time. It's already 5 o'clock, so this is what I propose. I mean, This, at the very, I mean, watching you guys think together is already just a treat and a joy. It's been amazing. I'd like to give Mayanthi and Jyoti, time to kind of respond if you want to any of these. Not that they're these pointed, challenges, but you've been taking in a lot all this time. And then maybe we can just take 15 minutes. We have the reception. We can continue the conversation. So I want to let you guys, if you want. Otherwise, we'll maybe collect some thoughts from a patient group of people who've been listening for a long time.
I think we can
Okay,
go just directly.
Great. So why don't we collect a few questions and
You guys have been sitting
add
there
them
for
to
an
the
hour.
Yeah, just real quick, I enjoyed the papers a great deal and the comments as well. That's really a treat to hear. So I have a question for Mayanthi. It's actually about the self-forgettingism in Charles Taylor. So what I felt listening to your paper, I thought that interestingly, I found the drawing on Charles Taylor a little bit strange, only because I thought your paper was really exquisite, and that actually there's a really sophisticated deployment, but implicit deployment of Hegel in the paper anyway, without reaching for Taylor, and that when you reach for Taylor, something else potentially happens. And so I guess one way to think about this is that, for me at least, is that you seem you have two different kinds of political actors that you foregrounded in the talk. One is like the woman with the veil who held up the voting registration card or ID card, and the other, Eunice and Farid. But in the talk, in one way, I mean, I could totally see Farid standing there with the French revolutionaries because in a way he's kind of a statesman, And I think the statesman approach is one thing, and I think sort of Taylor's invocation of Hegel takes you down the road of sort of ethical norms. And what he seems to understand is a perspectival understanding of recognition, either the master or the slave and this kind of thing. Whereas I felt like in your paper, which you teased out, you had a concern for kind of technologies of social differentiation and rights and sort of forms of subjugation. I mean, your talk allowed for a much more capacious sense of the polity and the nature of the polity. So just like real quick to say what I thought you did, right? So you said, you talked with woman's ID card, you talked about difference was being relational, you talked about wholeness versus oneness, ad hoc political formations, the future remains unpredictable, and that to me was a kind of political transformation was sort of well underway, and it's easy to see how it could play out. And I think it's just to me a danger in framing it as a question of, say, reason, or capacity for reason or not, or making it a more ethical issue, or even a question of sort of, well, because...
But you think I was doing?
No, I think Taylor tends to that way. Because for instance, like, and I think it's worth noting that, say, the question of voting, registration rights, and voting suppression, this kind of issue, is somewhat different from a claim to rights, right? Because even Farid said, I don't want the right to this, I want the right to that. But that's the discourse of rights. And you said yourself, Eunice declaration, right? And the rights in declaration is one direction that one could take. And because even to go back to Hegel, right, I think, interestingly, both empirically and theoretically, right, Hegel is sitting in this conversation, because when Hegel talks about how he sees North Africa, right, in philosophy of history, he actually excises it from the African continent, which he calls the land of childhood, and says he sees it as civilized, but he also is looking at how African people's customs, habits, rituals, and for him it's like the way Africans live their lives makes them uncivilized, right? So I think there's a way to read Hegel as having a theory about how polity is constructed, and I thought your argument did a much better job than does Taylor's of showing how the polity is constituted and how different kinds of regimes of differentiation have different kinds of political consequences. So I actually felt like if you bracket Taylor in your own analysis was sort of much more sophisticated, and that Taylor's formulation of Hegel was much more wobbly than yours.
So going still with this thing of the recognition that is unrecognized, I kept thinking of that other exception in a whole lot of the things we hear, namely the fact that Israel doesn't recognize its own borders, but it's asking, of course, whatever partner for peace it can find to recognize its existence, right, as a Jewish democratic state. Jewish and democratic state, as the Zionists formulate it. So I'm actually struck at a particular instance where you would have, in fact, a demand for recognition, which of course is completely insane because it demands a recognition that it cannot give itself. Although, and I don't mean to pull a Derrida here, there is something about reality effects. In other words, to go to this original binary opposition that Derrida would have undone, namely writing and orality, one of the things that is nonetheless interesting about these binaries is the fact that they persist. Right? And so I'm kind of concerned about, and again, I don't mean to pull anything here, but the moment where France is never, or sovereignty is never what it has thought itself to be, because there is a thing, that within deconstructive terms would be called the reality effect.
Right.
And I'm not sure exactly what it is that we're saying. If we recognize that there is a demand for recognition that doesn't speak itself, it comes from a place that appears to have, one, the luxury of not voicing its demand, at the very same time as it enforces the name, as it were, of that which is allowed thanks to. And I mean, I'm game with everybody who wants to blame Charles Taylor, but I'm under the impression that he's the voice of a certain number of masters here. In other words, it's not just a particular opinion that Charles Taylor has. Yes? It's not like, oh well, we all believe him. Yes, we're talking about something that not to be too aloof. But we're talking about states, yes? We're talking about apparatuses that are not asking for recognition, but are enforcing their own denial of the demand that they make on particular others. So when is it exactly that sovereignty was never what it thought it was? I mean, maybe it was never what it thought it was, but it appears to have worked enough to make it possible for a whole lot of people to not be whatever they want to name or not name themselves. So I suppose that's my concern, and I want, maybe unfairly actually, to pick up on the phrase that everybody loved, which is a very lovable phrase, capacious citizenship. At a time when, in fact, I think what Jari you're describing is precisely the fact that that which the kind of marginalization, what a stupid word at this point, the kind of devastation that is increasingly, I'm a devolutionist, increasingly permissible on a larger number of people, is now in fact affecting citizens, right? I mean, it's the whole, the chicken come home to roost kind of thing, yes? That what we are witnessing is in fact citizens that are now being more and more treated like the colonized, those who are not citizens. And so I'm a little concerned about the affirmation of inclusiveness. Like also now, if we are all included in the capacious citizenship, then we would all be better off. Or is that the future that we want to actually claim when one of the reasons why that can be done is because they let everybody in now, right? At the very same time, again, where the treatment of citizens is now, we have drones now that are pretty soon going to,
become citizens.
Yeah. Exactly.
Can we respond? Or
Sure.
do you have to take, are there more questions? Brian?
Very quickly, because I so often you'll pull the rug out from yeah, continuing with the recognition just a little bit more. I was wondering if the undoing of the recognition dialectic by your interlocutors, you didn't speak directly about sovereignty, but if you see it as simultaneously undoing the sovereignty that authorizes the very possibility of the French nation state. Maybe that's just a question of clarification. And I guess it's tied to the possibility that being French Muslim is a way of changing not only according to many French politicians and citizens what it means to be Muslim, but also what it means to be French. There's a very radical kind of potential, as others have pointed out, in this repudiation of the right to difference. Even if, and this is, I guess, another quick question, does framing it as a right not to difference, but a right to indifference, undercut some of the potential for the kind of future that you're trying to gesture toward. That's a side question, but okay, so yeah, is this undercutting the this refusal or repudiation of this dialectic of recognition? Is it pulling the rug out from underneath the possibility of the sovereignty that authorizes Frenchness, or can it also be seen, or is it seen by your interlocutors just to the extent that they want to be French? Is it cast as a kind of true realization of what it truly means to have a French political sensibility, and almost in the way that so many of the radical French philosophers and other want to see their radical democratic theories as not a disavowal of an entire edifice of European thought, but as its sort of flower, as its ultimate fruition, or even its deconstructed fruition, which would also align with Saint Benedict, rest in peace, his ideas about, so Christianity would be the missing term in all of this, the Christianity of Europe. Is this some sort of bizarre way of Muslims, if your interlocutors, claiming a kind of Christianity for themselves?
Say more why Christianity for themselves?
I mean, if in fact this undoing of all of, what seemed to be inescapable as far as the terms of political belonging and citizenship go, if that's not simply a disavowal of a certain type of sovereignty, a certain type of political logic, but an intensification or a realization, that these Muslim interlocutors are actually finding tapping into the kind of missing core or kernel of what it really means to be French today, to really have a political sensibility. I see that as a very, especially as it's been framed by people like Benedict and Taylor, and as a kind of a Christian movement.
Right.
So, and the Christian legacy of Europe and all of this.
Right.
So anyway, I don't know. It's a little jumbled.
Well, I think it's interesting. I think one of the interesting things is the whole question of ventriloquism for me, because I actually find the people who I work with, Muslim French, deeply conservative, precisely for the reasons that all of you have just outlined. At the same time, they're not entirely conservative either, right? And so, I agree that the very notion of citizenship is already inscribed into the kind of nation-state frame, at least in the way that they themselves see it. And in that sense, they are, in fact, they themselves claim to be the kind of French citizens that French citizens are not, right? So they sort of fulfill the promise. But I don't think that it's as simple as that either. I think that's the problem, right? And so, so on the one hand, yes, is it a fairly, it's both, it's sort of conservative and yet radical in conservatism in some ways, right? And one of the things that I didn't get a chance, because it was a 30-page paper and a 15-page talk. But, I don't think that I think that there is something to be said for the way in which there's a consistent reinscription of the nation form as the site of rights. In a way that actually, and in that sense, my interlocutors are quite different from yours, I think. I don't know if you want to, what you want to say about that, but I think in terms of what Gil, you call the reality effect, I don't think any of them are under any illusion that they're somehow going to change the world or change everything as we know it. But I think there's a sense in which this is a slow war of attrition, and that most likely they'll lose. We're all going to lose, right? But that doesn't mean that we just then, what do we, I mean, I know your response is then, the apocalypse, basically. But I think for most of us,
Ventriloquizing.
most of us have, I think that it's hard to just sort of be in that sense. And I think what all of us are trying to do, and in addition to our interlocutors, but certainly, I think this is what you were trying to do with this group itself, was to find the seams, in some sense, in which some kind of action could take place. And I think that there are two ways of, I think there are two important elements to that. One is that action can be found in these seams, but I think the other is exposing the seams. I think that in itself is both analytically and politically useful. Where that then goes is an open question. This is where
But you guys seem to be doing more. You're certainly doing that. But to give you, you're not just exposing the seams, which you certainly are. You're not just saying that these seams, as Judith, in a wonderful way pointed out, create the conditions for all kinds of different possibilities. But you're pointing to things that are happening, not just a simple empirical and descriptive. And you're kind of, listening to them and attending to them and theorizing them at the same time. And that seems to be what's so significant about this moment. We may all lose. I certainly am pessimistic in that way too. But France will lose too. And the point isn't right. The point. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that the French state isn't powerful. It doesn't mean that racialization, expropriation, exploitation, a kind of denial of dignity will not. I don't think either. And I'm sure you would agree. I don't think either of these papers or any of the kind of excited comments, Vincent apart, are kind of under any delusions that the French state is not as powerful or as racist, and that there are not extremely dark times ahead for Muslim French or kind of Guadeloupean, workers. But what seems to be so, I don't think the question is hope or despair or is politics possible or not, but beginning, and I sound more like an empiricist than I usually am, but beginning with the fact that in both of these cases, they're not asking for recognition, and that there are all these French books that are saying, something is happening at this moment that seems extremely interesting to me, that there's an actually existing way, as different as these two communities are, that they are living in a very politically creative way, different forms of being together and being political, which doesn't mean that we should evaluate, how radical or not radical, or whether they will succeed or their answers should be our answers, but that if we begin with the fact that they're not asking for recognition, and our theories and our kind of political metrics tell us they should, and starting there and saying, okay, so what does that mean about this moment? And this kind of after France stuff, I think there's something big to that. Something is fundamentally shifting. And the French and the political theorists in a certain way are the last to know, which doesn't mean that the power asymmetries are going to disappear, but it seems to kind of signal a very different moment in terms of, so what I love, for example, is the us and them in the LKP, a fundamental refiguring of the axis of differentiation. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be more politically effective or empowered, but the fact that the kind of political landscape, and in that sense the lived political imagination, not just an imagination of what a better world might look like, is fundamentally shifting, or this claim for your poetry and and I guess the LKP poetry, the fact that this kind of poetry as a need, as a kind of as crucial for the conditions of being fully human, is not linked to an identitarian claim of letting our culture be. I mean, it's obviously inflected with that, but all these little things seem to signal, maybe not a cause for hopefulness, but something that needs to be, there's a way in which these cases signal a very different political landscape that I think, the enactment in the National Assembly, is just kind of dealing with that fact. And it seems very striking that both of these communities are not concerned with not being recognized in the way that we are trained to believe.